She had 30 seconds to decide whether to destroy a stranger's life or save it. The cameras were already flashing, the microphones were already thrust forward like weapons, and the man beside her, the most powerful billionaire in New York City, had just grabbed her arm and whispered 4 words that would unravel everything she'd spent a decade carefully building. Play along, please. Now. Emily Hayes had survived poverty, a sick mother, crushing debt, and 7 years of 80-hour work weeks. She had survived a lot of things. She had never survived something like this. If you've ever made one decision that completely rewrote your entire life, stay with me. Because this story is about to get very real. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled. And don't forget to hit that like button before we begin. The morning Ryan Carter's world fell apart started like every other morning. Too early, too loud, and without nearly enough coffee. His penthouse alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., which was 13 minutes before it was actually set, because his 6-year-old daughter Lily had climbed into his bed sometime around 3 in the morning and somehow managed to hit the clock with her elbow in her sleep. She did this at least twice a week. Ryan had stopped being annoyed by it somewhere around the 4th month after her arrival into his life, back when he still believed parenthood was something a person could learn from a book. He lay there for a moment in the gray pre-dawn light, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom. 2,200 square feet of Manhattan real estate that a magazine once called austere in its perfection. What the magazine didn't mention was the crayon drawing currently taped beside the window, or the small collection of plastic horses arranged on the nightstand because Lily had decided his room was too empty and sad. She wasn't wrong. Ryan slid out of bed carefully, the way he'd learned to move after months of sleeping beside a child who woke at the slightest sound. He stood over her for a moment, this small, dark-haired person who had somehow become the entire weight and warmth of his existence, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that he never talked about with anyone. Not grief, exactly. Not anymore. Something quieter than that. Something that lived just underneath everything. He got dressed in the dark. Navy suit, white shirt, no tie yet. He'd put it on in the car. He had a meeting with the board at 8, a call with Tokyo at 10, and a lunch with 3 senators that his PR director Marcus had scheduled 3 weeks ago and that Ryan had been quietly dreading ever since. He didn't know yet that none of those things would matter. He didn't know yet that by 9 o'clock, his entire life would have already been dismantled on live television. The story broke at 6:14 a.m. Ryan was in the kitchen, making Lily's lunch. Peanut butter, no jelly, cut diagonally because she'd once explained to him with absolute seriousness that triangles tasted better, when his phone started going insane. Marcus called first, then his lawyer, then his lawyer again, then a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be a reporter from the Post asking for comment. He didn't answer any of them. He finished the sandwich, put it in the blue lunchbox with the small horse sticker on the front, and set it by the front door. Then he picked up his phone and opened the news. Carter Fiancée exposes billionaire's double life. Sources claim engagement was a corporate arrangement from the start. He read the headline 3 times. Then he read the article. It took him approximately 4 minutes to understand exactly how comprehensively he had been destroyed. The piece was long, detailed, meticulously sourced, clearly weeks in the making. It laid out, with receipts, the timeline of his engagement to Victoria Ashworth, 31. Heiress to the Ashworth hospitality empire. How the engagement had been brokered not out of love, but out of a merger negotiation that Ryan's board had quietly encouraged after a rough 3rd quarter. How Victoria had apparently discovered, 3 weeks ago, that Ryan had been seeing someone casually on the side, a fact Ryan had not fully disclosed to the Post reporter and would not disclose here because it was complicated and human and deeply uncomfortable. How Victoria, in retaliation, had gone to 3 different media outlets simultaneously. The photographs were the worst part. Someone had given them photographs of Ryan at a charity event 6 months ago, leaning close to another woman. Of Ryan and Victoria at a press conference, her smile wide and practiced, his hand on the small of her back looking like a man completing a transaction rather than touching someone he loved. Of Ryan's face, from a distance, looking tired. He sat with his phone on the kitchen counter for a long moment. "Daddy?" He looked up. Lily was standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, the ones with the small foxes on them, her dark hair going in approximately 7 directions. She was looking at him with those enormous eyes she'd inherited from her mother, dark and watchful and entirely too perceptive for a 6-year-old. "Hey, Bug." He kept his voice level. He'd gotten very good at that. "You're up early. I heard your phone making the angry sounds. It does that sometimes." She considered this. "Are you in trouble?" He picked up her lunchbox and held it out. "Mrs. Donnelly's going to be here in 20 minutes. Go get dressed." She took the lunchbox but didn't move. "That means yes." "Lily." Okay. She patted back down the hallway, muttering something under her breath that he chose not to hear clearly. He called Marcus back. "Oh, it's bad," Marcus said without preamble. He was already at the office. He was always already at the office, and Ryan could hear the particular quality of background silence that meant Marcus had cleared the room. Victoria did all three, Post, Times, and she went on Vanity Fair's podcast this morning at 6 a.m. "I know. The board is going to call an emergency meeting." "I know that too." "Ryan." Marcus paused. "The Davenport deal. If the board loses confidence right now, if the stock drops more than 12% before close, I know what happens." The Davenport acquisition had taken 18 months to build. It was the largest deal Carter Global had ever attempted. A $4.2 billion restructuring of a struggling tech infrastructure company that Ryan had believed in, genuinely believed in, when almost no one else did. The board had been skeptical from the beginning. They'd agreed to proceed largely because of Ryan's reputation for stability, for judgment, for being exactly the kind of unimpeachable figure that investors trusted. That reputation was, as of 6:14 this morning, approximately 8 hours old. "What do I do?" Ryan asked, and he hated himself a little for asking it, for needing someone else to have the answer. "Get to the office," Marcus said. "Don't talk to anyone on the way in. Keep your head down, say nothing, and we'll figure out the statement when you get here." "Right. And Ryan, the photographers are going to be outside the building." "How many?" A pause. "A lot." So he was right about that. Ryan's car pulled up to the Carter Global Tower at 7:48 a.m., and even from inside the tinted windows he could see them, 30, maybe 40 photographers clustered on the sidewalk and spilling into the street, plus what looked like 3 different news vans with satellite dishes raised. A uniformed building security guard was managing the crowd with the tired efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for 3 hours already. His driver, a quiet man named George, who had worked for him for 6 years, and who Ryan trusted completely, looked in the rear-view mirror. "Mr. Carter, we can go around to the parking garage on 54th. "No." Ryan adjusted his tie. "Front entrance." "Sir, it'll look worse if I avoid them." He said it calmly, because he'd thought it through on the drive over. Running looked guilty. Emerging from a parking garage looked guilty. Walking through his own front door, chin up, saying nothing. That was the only option that carried even a fragment of dignity. He was wrong about that too, as it turned out, but he didn't know it yet. "Okay," George said quietly. The car stopped. Ryan opened his own door. Another calculated choice. Having someone open it for you when you were already being accused of being out of touch was exactly the wrong image, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The noise was immediate. Not just the cameras, though those were a physical thing. The combined flash of 40 lenses turning the morning gray into stuttering white. But the voices too. Overlapping questions, a wall of them, each one designed to provoke a reaction. "Ryan, is it true the engagement was a business deal? Did you cheat on Victoria? How long? What does this mean for the Davenport acquisition? Ryan, over here. Did you know Victoria was going to the press?" He walked, head up, face neutral. He'd learned this from watching politicians handle press situations. The particular blankness that communicated "I hear you, and I am choosing not to respond," which was different from the blankness that communicated "I am panicking." He was about 15 feet from the revolving door when the additional complication arrived. Someone in the crowd, a reporter, young, aggressive, clearly the type who considered public ambush a legitimate journalistic method, broke from the pack and cut directly in front of him. "Ryan, one question. Just one. Is Victoria's account accurate? Was this entire relationship a financial arrangement?" Ryan stopped walking because he had to, because the man was directly in his path. He looked at him. He said nothing. "The public deserves to know," the reporter pressed. "Were you using Victoria Ashworth? And if so, is there anyone in your life that you actually, genuinely care about?" Or is everyone just a transaction to you? The question landed differently than the others. Ryan heard it the way you hear something when it's aimed precisely at the thing you're most afraid of. Is there anyone in your life that you actually care about? Lily's face. The fox pajamas. Are you in trouble, Daddy? He felt something shift, not anger exactly, more like a sudden, desperate, completely irrational need to prove something to a stranger with a microphone, which was exactly the kind of impulse he'd spent his adult life suppressing. Which was when the lobby doors behind him opened, and a woman in a gray coat walked out. Emily Hayes was running 7 minutes late, which for her was the equivalent of a personal catastrophe. She'd had a 7:30 client call that ran long, a divorce case, the kind where both parties were more interested in hurting each other than in anything resembling a settlement, and she'd finished it in the lobby of Carter Global, where she'd been meeting with a colleague from a firm that shared the 14th floor. She had her phone tucked under her chin, her briefcase in one hand, and her coffee in the other, and she was composing a mental list of everything she still needed to accomplish before noon. She was not paying attention to the crowd outside. She was not paying attention to anything except the increasingly complicated calculus of her own schedule. The revolving door deposited her directly into the middle of the worst morning of a stranger's life, and she almost walked straight past before she registered the wall of cameras and the dense, shouting crowd, and the tall man standing very still in the middle of it all, with an expression she recognized because she'd worn it herself. The expression of someone who is holding together by pure will and is fully aware that it won't last much longer. She slowed. She didn't mean to. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like the instinct she'd developed in 7 years of legal practice, the ability to read a room before you walked into it and understand where the pressure points were. The reporter was still talking. Because the people who invested in Carter Global deserve transparency. They deserve to know whether the man leading this company is capable of genuine commitment or whether the tall man's jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. But Emily caught it, and then something entirely inexplicable happened. He turned, not toward the cameras, not toward the reporter. He turned toward her, this woman he had never met, this completely random stranger in a gray coat with a coffee cup and a briefcase, and he looked at her with eyes that were exhausted and desperate, and also, she would think later, startlingly human. He took one step toward her, and then she heard it, low and urgent, for her ears only. I'm about to do something crazy. Please just go with it. I'll explain everything. She had about 2 seconds to make the decision. In those 2 seconds, the following things ran through Emily Hayes' mind. This is a stranger. You don't know him. Whatever he's about to do is going to involve you in something you want absolutely no part of. You're already late. You have 3 hearings this week and a motion due Friday, and your mother's appointment is Thursday, and you cannot... His hand found her arm, gently, not grabbing, more like asking. And then he turned toward the cameras, and in a voice that was calm and clear and carried across the entire chaotic crowd, he said, I'd like to introduce you all to my fiancée, Schatz. The world stopped, or it felt like it did. In reality, what happened was a collective inhale. 40 photographers, a dozen reporters, 3 camera operators, and approximately 15 curious bystanders all drawing breath at exactly the same moment. Then the cameras went absolutely insane. Emily stood very still beside him. Later, she would struggle to explain what happened in those next 20 seconds. Why she didn't step away. Why she didn't say, I don't know this man. Why she didn't do any of the logical, self-preserving things that a reasonable person would do. Part of it was the cameras. The sheer, overwhelming volume of them, all aimed at her face, all waiting to capture whatever she did next. There was something paralyzing about that many lenses pointed at you all at once, like standing in a spotlight with no script. Part of it was the man beside her, because he had chosen her. Out of everyone on this sidewalk, he had chosen her specifically, and the weight of that was strange and immediate, and not nothing. And part of it, the part she would be most honest about later, when she could be honest, was that she had spent 7 years being the most controlled person in every room she entered. The one who never made impulsive decisions. The one who calculated risk before she took a single step. And something about standing in the middle of this complete circus, in this impossible moment, with this stranger's hand gentle on her arm and 40 cameras in her face, something about it made her just the smallest bit furious and reckless. She smiled. Not a large smile. Not a performance. Just the slight, composed, slightly amused smile of a woman who is exactly where she intends to be and finds the fuss around her mildly entertaining. She leaned almost imperceptibly toward him, and the cameras went even more insane. Inside the lobby, it was different. The revolving doors cut off the noise like a seal, and suddenly they were standing in the marble quiet of Carter Global's ground floor. Soaring ceilings, muted footsteps, the distant sound of elevator banks. And Emily Hayes took a very careful breath and turned to face the man who had just announced to the world that she was his fiancée. Up close, he was different than she'd expected. Taller. She'd registered his height outside, but in the relative quiet of the lobby, it was more apparent. Dark circles under his eyes that his expensive suit didn't cover. A jaw that was tense in the specific way of someone who has been holding tension in the same place for a very long time. He looked, she thought, like a man who hadn't slept well in years. He also looked like he had absolutely no idea what to say to her. "Okay," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a professional habit she was deeply grateful for at this particular moment. "Start talking." He stopped. He actually ran a hand through his hair, which struck her as oddly human for someone who'd just delivered the world's most high-stakes lie with the composure of a press secretary. "I owe you an explanation." That's an understatement. She set her briefcase down, not because she was staying, but because it was heavy and her shoulder hurt. "I'm going to need a name first." He blinked. "Ryan Carter." She looked at him for a moment. "The Ryan Carter?" He seemed briefly uncomfortable. Yes, she had heard of Ryan Carter the way that anyone who read a newspaper or practiced corporate-adjacent law heard of Ryan Carter, as a name attached to money, to acquisitions, to the particular kind of low-grade civic mythology that Manhattan built around its wealthiest residents. She had not, until approximately 90 seconds ago, associated him with any specific face. She looked at him more carefully now. "Right," she said. "Ryan Carter, whose engagement just imploded in the news this morning." She watched his expression. "I read the headline on my phone during my call. Didn't read the article." "You'd know more about my morning if you had." "I'm getting the impression." She crossed her arms. "What exactly did you just do out there?" He exhaled. It was a long, controlled exhale, the kind that meant there was a lot more behind it. "I panicked." "You panicked?" This is not typically how I handle." He stopped again, and she watched him abandon 3 different sentence structures in real time. "The reporter asked me whether I was capable of actually caring about anyone, and you grabbed the nearest woman. I didn't grab, you grabbed my arm. Gently. You grabbed my arm and told 30 cameras I was your fiancé." She heard her own voice, level, slightly incredulous, not quite as angry as she probably should have been. "Walk me through the logic." There wasn't logic. It was... He met her eyes. It was desperate. It was wrong. And I am genuinely sorry. There was something in the apology that landed differently than she expected. Direct, without spin or deflection or the smooth corporate language she'd half anticipated. He was looking at her like a man who understood exactly what he'd done and wasn't trying to argue himself out of it. She found that, against her better judgment, marginally disarming. "Those cameras are still going to be out there when I leave this building," she said. "Yes. And whatever I said out there, what I did out there, that's going to be on the internet by now. Probably already is." She picked up her briefcase. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I need to be somewhere," she said. "Wait. I have a client meeting in 40 minutes, and I am already late, and you have just made my morning." She stopped herself. "You have made my morning significantly more complicated than it was supposed to be." "Emily," she paused. "How do you know my name?" He pointed very slightly toward the ID badge clipped to her coat, the one from the building security desk that she'd gotten when she'd come through at 7:15. It said, "Emily Hayes, visitor, floor 14. She looked down at it. She looked back up at him. "That," she said quietly, "is the most embarrassing 45 seconds of my life." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. "I have a proposal." "No." "You haven't heard." "No." She started walking toward the elevator bank. "Whatever it is, no." $2 million. She stopped walking. The lobby was quiet. Somewhere above them, an elevator dinged. She did not turn around immediately. She stood very still for a moment with her back to him, doing the particular kind of math that you do when someone says an amount of money that is so far outside the scope of your normal life that it takes a moment to process as real. Her mother's medical bills. The amount she'd seen on the statement last week. The one she'd folded and put in the back of a drawer because looking at it directly was too much. The debt from law school that still sent her a monthly reminder with a cheerful subject line that she'd started finding darkly funny. The amount of money it would take to make her mother comfortable. To actually make her comfortable. Not managed, not barely covered, but genuinely properly cared for. She turned around slowly. Ryan Carter was standing exactly where she'd left him, watching her. $2 million, she repeated. For what? 3 months. He said it carefully, the way you say something you've been working up to and you're not sure how it's going to land. You would pretend to be my fiancée for 3 months. Public appearances? Family events? Enough time for the narrative to shift, for the board to stabilize, for the Davenport deal to close. And then what? And then we announce very quietly that we've decided we're better as friends. Amicable split. You walk away with $2 million and we never have to see each other again. Emily was quiet. I know how it sounds, he said. Do you? She looked at him. It sounds like you want to buy me. I want to... He paused. I want to hire you for a specific time-limited purpose. I know it's deeply weird. Yes. Ethically questionable. Also, yes. Potentially illegal, depending on how you characterize it to the IRS. My lawyers will handle the structure. She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. You have lawyers for that. I have lawyers for most things. Except... He stopped. Except what? He looked at her, and for a moment the careful composure slipped, just slightly, just enough to see something underneath it. Except the things that matter. She stood in the lobby of his building and looked at the most powerful man in the room, and saw, underneath the expensive suit and the exhaustion and the desperate improvisation of the last 15 minutes, something that she recognized because she'd been living with a version of it for years. A person who was holding everything together alone and was very, very tired of it. She had meant to say no. She had every reason to say no. I need 3 days to think about it, she said instead. Something shifted in his face. I need an answer today. 2 days. Emily, Mr. Carter, she kept her voice even. You grabbed my arm on a public sidewalk and told 30 cameras I was your fiancé without asking me first. You can wait 2 days. He was quiet for a moment. Fair enough, he said. Done. She thought about it for exactly 14 hours. She thought about it on the subway uptown. She thought about it through her client meeting, which she handled on autopilot, and through her lunch, which she barely ate, and through the afternoon deposition that she conducted with the particular focused calm that had made her reputation in a field where composed was the only thing that kept you standing. She thought about it at 7 o'clock in the evening in her apartment in Washington Heights, which was small and clean and full of her mother's plants, sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open to the medical billing portal and a cup of tea going cold beside her. Her mother, Margaret Hayes, was asleep in the bedroom down the hall. She was 61, and she had spent 25 years cleaning other people's houses, and her body had finally decided it was done. The kidneys first, then the joints, then the slow, grinding reality of chronic illness that didn't kill you dramatically, just made every day incrementally harder. She needed care that the insurance didn't cover, and that Emily had been piecing together from her salary, month by month, like building a wall out of sand. Emily looked at the balance on the screen. She thought about what $2 million would mean. Then she closed the laptop and called Ryan Carter. He answered on the second ring. You said 2 days, he said. I know what I said. She looked at the wall of her kitchen, her mother's handmade calendar, the plant in the window, the ordinary textures of the life she'd built. I have conditions. A pause. Tell me. The money goes into an account I control from day one, not at the end, at the start. Half up front, he said, half at the 3-month mark. She thought about it. Fine. Second condition. You don't touch my schedule. I have clients. I have a job. Whatever we do for appearances has to work around my actual life. Agreed. Third condition. She paused. If at any point this starts causing me professional damage, but anything that could touch my license or my standing with the bar, it ends. Immediately. No negotiation. Understood. And one more thing. She looked at the calendar on the wall, her mother's handwriting, Thursday circled in red. I need to know, before I agree to anything, why this matters enough for you to offer $2 million to a woman you met 45 minutes ago. A long silence. My daughter, he said. She's 6. She lost her mother when she was 2, and I have spent 4 years trying to build something stable for her. Something that doesn't shake every time the news decides I'm the story of the week. Emily said nothing. If this deal falls apart, he continued, if the board loses confidence and the stock tanks and the Davenport acquisition collapses, it's not just money, it's 4 years of work. It's the stability I've been building for her. And right now, the only thing that might hold it together long enough is the story you and I started this morning in that lobby. The silence stretched. Her name, Emily said. What's her name? Another pause, Tom, shorter this time, but somehow heavier. Lily. Emily looked at the calendar, at her mother's handwriting. I'll be at your office tomorrow morning at 8, she said. Have the contract ready. She hung up before he could say anything else, because she didn't want to hear whatever he might say, and she didn't want to examine too closely the reasons she'd just agreed to the most complicated and arguably insane decision of her professional life. She picked up her cold tea. She drank it. She looked at the plants on the windowsill, her mother's, all of them, tended every morning with the particular care that Margaret Hayes gave to things she loved. In the bedroom down the hall, she could hear the soft, steady sound of her mother breathing. She thought about Lily. She thought about a 6-year-old in fox pajamas who had already lost one person. She thought about the particular exhaustion in Ryan Carter's face. Not the performed kind, not the kind that wealthy men sometimes displayed as a form of relatability, but the real kind, the bone-deep kind, the kind that came from years of holding something important and being terrified of dropping it. She was going to regret this. She was almost certain she was going to regret this, but she picked up her phone and texted her best friend Diane. Don't Google me until tomorrow. I'll explain then. Try not to panic. 3 seconds later. Emily. Emily. I already Googled you. Emily. What? She set the phone face down. She went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well. The contract was 42 pages long, which she found either thorough or excessive depending on how charitable she was feeling about the whole situation. She read all 42 pages. She made 17 notes. She requested 4 amendments. Ryan's legal team, 3 lawyers who looked like they'd also not slept, accepted 12 of them without argument, which told her that either they were extraordinarily reasonable or Ryan had instructed them to be accommodating, which told her something about him. The meeting took place in a conference room on the 43rd floor of Carter Global, and Emily was acutely conscious, sitting across from the lawyers and the silent, watchful figure of Ryan Carter at the head of the table, that she was making a decision that could not be unmade. She signed the contract at 10:22 a.m. Ryan signed it at 10:23. Their eyes met briefly across the table, his unreadable, hers, she hoped, equally so. So, she said, capping her pen. What happens now? Now, said Marcus, Ryan's PR director, who had been sitting in the corner of the room vibrating with barely contained energy for the past 2 hours. We build a love story. Emily looked at him. I'm a lawyer, not an actress. You did pretty well this morning, Marcus said. I was terrified this morning. Exactly, he said, and he smiled for the first time. That's going to be very convincing. The first week was, charitably, a disaster. Not publicly. Publicly, it was going exactly the way Marcus had designed. The photo from the lobby, Emily's composed smile, her almost lean toward Ryan, the intimacy suggested by proximity, had been on the front page of 3 different outlets by noon. The narrative had shifted, exactly as intended, from billionaire's cheating scandal to mystery woman. Who is Ryan Carter's real fiancée? Marcus was practically vibrating. The board had not immediately called a meeting to remove Ryan as CEO, which he described as a win. Privately, everything was more complicated. Emily and Ryan were strangers who had now agreed to perform a relationship for public consumption, which meant that every time they were in the same room together, for background meetings with Marcus, for the carefully orchestrated coffee shop appearance on Thursday, for the brief and awkward dinner at a restaurant where 3 photographers were conveniently positioned, there was the particular tension of 2 people who do not know each other trying to appear like they do. They were bad at it in the beginning, not catastrophically bad, but bad in the small, observable ways. The half-second hesitation before he touched her arm, the way she occasionally called him Mr. Carter by mistake in public, the stilted quality of their early conversations that suggested two actors who hadn't yet found their rhythm. "We need to know things about each other," Emily said, on the fourth day, sitting across from him in a small private room off his office, where they'd taken a meeting for 30 minutes every morning to coordinate schedules. "Real things. Because if someone asks me your favorite food and I say I don't know, that's going to look..." "Pizza," Ryan said. She blinked. "What?" "My favorite food. It's pizza." He looked at her. "Plain cheese, from a place on 48th Street that's been there since the 80s, and that my board would be appalled to know I eat in once a week." She looked at him for a moment. "Pasta," she said, "with too much garlic, which is the only way to make pasta." "Noted. My mother makes it. Made it. She doesn't cook much anymore." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she'd learned to talk about her mother's health. Clinical, not sentimental, because sentiment made it harder to manage. She grew up in a tiny town in Ohio, and she learned to cook Italian from a neighbor, and she always added too much garlic because the neighbor was, in her words, extremely generous with the garlic. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "Where is she now? Your mother?" "Washington Heights, with me." She met his eyes. "She lives with me." He nodded slowly, like he was filing it away. "Lily asked me this morning why she can't meet you yet." Emily's chest did something complicated. "What did you tell her?" "That you were very busy, and that we'd find a time." He paused. "She told me that was what people said when they didn't actually have a plan." "She's 6. She's been doing this since she was 4. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. More like a reflex, the automatic response of a parent to evidence of their child's personality. She has a very low tolerance for vague answers. "She sounds," Emily chose her word carefully, "like someone worth knowing." He looked at her. "We'll arrange it," he said, "when you're ready." She wasn't sure she'd be ready, exactly, but she nodded anyway and moved on to the schedule for the following week, and tried not to think about a 6-year-old in fox pajamas who already knew when adults were avoiding the question. On Friday of that first week, something happened that wasn't on Marcus's schedule. Emily was in Ryan's office, actually in his office, not the side room, because Marcus had decided they needed to be seen together in his primary workspace for a photo that was going to be candid in the specific way that Marcus's candids were candid, which was to say staged with surgical precision. When Ryan's phone rang, he glanced at it. His expression changed in a way that was small and immediate, and that Emily had been unconsciously cataloging for a week. "I need to take this," he said. "Give me a minute." He stepped toward the window, his back to the room, his voice dropping to something too low for Emily to catch clearly, but she could read the set of his shoulders, the way they shifted, the particular quality of the pause before he spoke. She looked away. She looked at his desk. It was, she'd noticed over the past week, oddly personal for the office of a man who ran a $4 billion company. No family photos on the desk itself. That would have been too exposed, too available to the various reporters and investors who passed through. But if you knew to look, it was everywhere in small details. A small crayon drawing framed on the shelf behind his chair. A horse figurine on the windowsill that she was fairly certain was a gift from Lily. A worn copy of the Phantom toll booth wedged between 2 legal binders, which she found so unexpectedly charming that she pretended not to notice it. He came back from the window, and whatever had been on the phone had rearranged something in his face. "I have to go," he said. She stood up. "Everything okay?" He was already moving, retrieving his jacket from the back of his chair. "It's Lily. She had a rough day at school. Her teacher called." "What kind of rough day?" He stopped for a moment, and she could see him deciding how much to say. "She got into an argument with another kid. Something about her mother." He said it without inflection, the way you say things that have sharp edges when you've learned to carry them carefully. "She does this sometimes, when something reminds her." Emily was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "Just that." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it, and she could tell because it was simple, and he didn't explain it or follow it with anything else. He left. She stood in his office for a moment after he was gone, looking at the crayon drawing on the shelf. A horse, she thought, and beside it what might have been a person, and something in the corner that she couldn't quite make out. She picked up her briefcase. She went back to her own work. But she thought about the drawing for the rest of the afternoon, and she thought about a little girl who sometimes had rough days when something reminded her of the person who was missing, and she thought about how many years of those days there had been and might still be. And she thought about how, against every reasonable plan she had for herself, she was starting to care what happened in this family. That was the thing about Ryan Carter that no one had warned her about. He was not the man in the headlines. He was not the arrogant billionaire, the calculating deal maker, the man who treated every relationship as a transaction. He was a tired father who made his daughter's lunch every morning and cut the sandwiches in triangles because she'd told him triangles tasted better. And Emily Hayes, who had survived quite a lot in her life, was not sure she was prepared for that. The Carter family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was the kind of place that didn't try to impress you. It didn't have to. It sat back from the road behind a long gravel drive lined with oak trees that had been there longer than the house itself, and the house, 3 stories, pale stone, ivy climbing the east wing, had the settled, unapologetic quality of old money that has never once felt the need to explain itself. Emily looked at it through the car window and felt the very specific anxiety of someone who grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and who has spent the last 15 years pretending that kind of background doesn't follow you into rooms like this one. "You're quiet," Ryan said from the driver's seat. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She looked at the house. "About the fact that I grew up sharing a bedroom with my mother until I was 12 because we couldn't afford a 2-bedroom, and now I'm about to walk into that and pretend I belong there." He was quiet for a moment. The gravel crunched under the tires. "You don't have to pretend anything," he said. "Ryan." She said his name with the particular patience she used when she was explaining something obvious. "I absolutely have to pretend things. That is the entire premise of our arrangement. I mean," he seemed to struggle with the sentence, "you don't have to pretend to be someone you're not. You just have to be convincingly in love with a billionaire I've known for 11 days. "Yes." "Right." She picked up her bag from the floor. "No pretending involved at all." He pulled the car to a stop in front of the wide stone steps, and before either of them could say anything else, the front door opened and a woman appeared at the top of the steps. Who could only be Eleanor Carter, Ryan's mother, 63, silver-haired, wearing a silk blouse that probably cost more than Emily's monthly student loan payment, looking down at the car with an expression of careful, controlled welcome that Emily recognized as the face of a woman who had strong opinions she was temporarily keeping to herself. "She doesn't know," Ryan had told her the previous evening during their now daily 30-minute briefing. "About the arrangement. None of my family does. As far as they're concerned, this is real." Emily had looked at him across the small table. "Does that bother you, lying to your family?" He'd been quiet long enough that she'd known the answer before he said it. "Yes," he'd said. "But the alternative is worse." She hadn't pushed. She understood choosing the option that was less bad. Standing now at the bottom of the stone steps with the autumn air cold and sharp, and Eleanor Carter looking down at her with those careful eyes, Emily made a decision. She was going to walk into this house as herself, not a performance of someone wealthier or smoother or more polished than she actually was, not an apology for where she'd come from. Just Emily Hayes, 30 years old, lawyer, daughter of Margaret Hayes, who taught herself Italian cooking from a generous neighbor and raised a daughter alone, who had been told in one form or another her entire life that rooms like this one were not for people like her. She was going to walk in anyway. She straightened her coat, picked up her bag, and went up the steps. "Mrs. Carter," she said, holding out her hand. "I'm Emily. It's good to meet you." Eleanor looked at the hand, then she took it, and her grip was firm and dry and assessing. "Emily." She said the name like she was taking its measure. "Ryan told me very little about you." "That sounds like Ryan," Emily said. Behind her, she heard Ryan make a sound that was not quite a cough. Eleanor's expression shifted. Not warming exactly, but recalibrating. "Come inside," she said. "Lunch is at 1. There were 8 of them at lunch. Eleanor at the head of the table. Ryan's uncle, Gerald, 67, who had been on the Carter Global Board for 20 years, and who had the particular manner of men who believed that skepticism is a form of intelligence. Ryan's cousin, Diana, 35, effortlessly elegant in the way that came from never having to think about money, who looked at Emily with open curiosity rather than hostility, which Emily decided to count as a win. Diana's husband, Thomas, who was pleasant and largely silent, and who spent most of the meal cutting his food into very small pieces. Ryan's aunt, Patricia, who had married into the family 40 years ago, and who compensated for this by being the most aggressively Carter of all of them. And at the far end of the table, half hidden behind an oversized linen napkin, Lily. Lily was watching Emily with the unsettling, unblinking attention of a child who has not yet learned to be subtle about her assessments. Emily met her gaze, smiled just slightly. Lily did not smile back, but she also didn't look away, which Emily suspected was a form of respect. The first 30 minutes went reasonably well. Eleanor asked measured questions, where Emily had grown up, where she'd gone to school, how long she'd been practicing law, and Emily answered them honestly, with the calm clarity she used in depositions, which turned out to be useful here because the principle was the same. Say the truth in a way that controls the room. Columbus, Eleanor repeated when Emily mentioned Ohio. And your family? My mother. She lives with me in Manhattan now. Emily reached for her water glass. She's not well. A brief pause around the table, the kind that acknowledged the statement without knowing what to do with it. I'm sorry to hear that, Eleanor said, and she sounded like she meant it, which surprised Emily slightly. Gerald, who had been quiet with the particular quality of a man loading a question, chose this moment to deploy it. So, how did you two actually meet? Ryan was very vague on the details. Emily felt Ryan go still beside her. She had felt it before. This particular quality of his stillness, the way he went quiet in the face of difficulty, like a machine conserving power. She put down her water glass. We met in Ryan's lobby, she said, about 6 weeks ago. Both of these things were true. She was very careful to say only things that were true. It wasn't planned. I was there for a meeting and we ended up talking and she glanced at Ryan, and this was the part that wasn't scripted, that she hadn't prepared, and maybe that's why it came out the way it did. He was different than I expected. Different how? Diana asked, leaning forward slightly with the energy of someone who was genuinely interested rather than interrogating. Emily looked at Ryan. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Careful, attentive, something underneath it that she couldn't name. He was honest, she said, about the things that mattered to him. He told me about Lily within about 10 minutes of meeting me. She paused. Most people lead with the things that make them impressive. He led with the thing that made him human. Silence. Ryan looked at the table. At the far end, Lily lowered her napkin and looked at Emily with an expression that was, for the first time, slightly less guarded. Gerald was not done. The timing is interesting, he said in the tone of a man delivering an observation rather than an accusation. Given everything that happened with Victoria. Gerald, Eleanor said, I'm only noting. You're only asking Emily to justify herself at my lunch table, Eleanor said, and her voice was perfectly pleasant, which is not something we're going to do. Gerald subsided. Thomas cut another small piece of his food. Emily looked at Eleanor, who had turned back to her salad with the composed efficiency of a woman who has been managing this family for decades and finds it largely tedious. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of mutual recognition. After lunch, Diana cornered Emily in the hallway. Ignore Gerald, she said, without preamble. He does that to everyone. He did it to Thomas for the first 3 years, and Thomas is the most inoffensive person alive. She paused. You handled it well. I've done depositions. Diana laughed. Genuine, surprised. I like you, she said. I wasn't expecting to. That's honest. Ryan hasn't brought anyone to a family lunch in 4 years. Diana said it matter-of-factly, watching Emily's face with the same curious attention she'd had at the table. I mean, not counting Victoria, and she stopped. Sorry, that's probably not... It's fine, Emily said. You can say her name. She's not Voldemort. Diana looked at her for a moment. No, she said slowly. I suppose she's not. She tilted her head. What are you actually doing with him? And I mean that kindly. He's my cousin, and I love him, but he's not easy. He's been alone for so long he's basically forgotten how to let anyone in. Whatever you said at that table about him leading with the thing that made him human, she paused. He must really trust you. He doesn't do that. Emily held that sentence for a moment. I'm still figuring it out, she said, which was the truest thing she could say. But the crisis came in the afternoon, as crises tend to, When everyone's guard is slightly lower and the day has settled into a false sense of safety. It came in the form of Patricia, who had apparently spent the lunch composing a more tactical approach than Gerald's direct questioning, and who found Emily on the back terrace where she'd stepped out for 5 minutes of cold air and the specific relief of being unobserved. "You grew up in Ohio," Patricia said, appearing beside her with a glass of wine she'd carried from inside, without preamble or greeting, like a woman continuing a conversation that existed entirely in her own head. "Middle of nowhere." "Columbus," Emily said. 3 million people in the metro, not quite nowhere. Patricia smiled thinly. "You went to law school on scholarships?" "And loans," Emily said pleasantly. "Quite a lot of loans. Ryan's world is—" Patricia paused, swirling her wine. "It's particular. His daughter's school alone costs more per year than most people's mortgages. His family, his social obligations, the expectations. It's a very specific kind of life. Not everyone is suited to it." She looked at Emily sideways. "Not everyone comes from the kind of background that prepares you for it." Emily looked at the garden below the terrace. Brown November grass, bare trees, a stone path that curved toward something she couldn't quite see. She thought about being 17 and applying for every scholarship she could find, about her mother working doubles so she could study for the LSAT, about the particular texture of rooms you weren't supposed to be in and the decision, the daily, deliberate, exhausting decision, to act like you belonged in them anyway. "I grew up poor," Emily said conversationally. "My mother cleaned houses for 25 years. We had exactly one nice thing in our apartment, a set of good dishes she found at a garage sale that she used only on special occasions because she was saving them for when life got better." She paused. "I've been in rooms all my life that people decided I wasn't supposed to be in. I have had to convince partners at law firms, judges, clients, opposing counsel, and occasionally my own colleagues that I belong in places they had already decided I didn't." She finally looked at Patricia directly. "I've been doing that since I was 18. I'm very good at it." Patricia looked at her. "I'm not threatening you," Emily continued pleasantly. "I'm just giving you some background, since you asked." A long moment passed. The garden sat below them, still and cold. "Fair enough," Patricia said, which Emily suspected might be the closest Patricia Carter came to conceding anything. She went back inside. Ryan was waiting just inside the door, slightly around the corner from the terrace entrance, and from his expression she knew immediately that he had been able to hear at least part of that. "I didn't need rescuing," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't coming to rescue you. I was coming to—" He stopped. "I don't know what I was coming to do." "How much did you hear?" "Enough." He was looking at her with an expression she'd started to recognize, the one where he was thinking something he wasn't sure how to say, which was not common for him. He was generally precise. "The dishes," he said. She looked at him. "You told Patricia about the dishes." It made the point. "Emily," he seemed to be working towards something. "I want to say something, and I'm not sure how to say it without it sounding like, 'Ryan.'" She kept her voice level. "Just say it. I think you are—" He paused. "I think you are the most capable person I have been in a room with in a long time. And I have been in rooms with people who run countries." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a very strange compliment," she said. "I know, He looked almost frustrated with himself. "I'm not good at this." "Compliments?" "Saying things." A beat. "Saying things that aren't about work." She thought, not for the first time, about how lonely that must be, to have a life that vast and to have spent so long in it, being fluent only in the language of transactions. "You're doing fine," she said, and she meant it simply, without weight. He nodded once. From inside the house, they could hear Lily's voice. She was talking to Diana, something animated about horses, her small voice carrying through the rooms. Ryan's whole face changed when he heard it. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in movies, some sudden illumination. Just a quiet, settling shift, like a house adjusting to the weather. "She likes you," he said. "She doesn't like most people. She hasn't talked to me yet." "No, but she watched you through all of lunch. When Lily watches you, she's deciding." He paused. "She's decided." Emily looked through the glass door into the warm interior of the house, where she could see Lily gesturing at something, enthusiastic and unself-conscious in the way children only are when they feel safe. She looks like you, Emily said. She looks like her mother, he said. And there was nothing complicated in the way he said it. Just fact, just truth, with the particular steadiness of someone who has done a lot of work to get to the place where they can say something simply. I'm sorry, Emily said, which was also just fact, also just truth. Thank you, he said, for the second time in 2 weeks. With the same uncomplicated sincerity that she was starting to learn was one of his actual characteristics, underneath everything else. The board meeting was on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into the arrangement, and it was not on Marcus's schedule because it was not supposed to exist. Ryan texted Emily at 6:47 a.m. Emergency board call moved to in person. 9 a.m. Davenport deal under review. Don't come in, nothing for you to do today. She read it, put her phone down, and then picked it up again and replied, I'll be there at 8:30. Emily, I said, don't. I heard what you said. She was at Carter Global at 8:22. Ryan met her in the lobby, not the lobby where everything had started, a different one, the one at the base of the elevator banks, with the expression of a man who has not slept and is too tired to argue. What are you doing here, he said. I reviewed the Davenport acquisition filing last night. She handed him a coffee. She'd stopped at the place on his block that she'd learned he actually liked, not the expensive one his assistant ordered from. You sent me the board materials 2 weeks ago, so I understood the context for the public statements. I read them. He took the coffee. You read 400 pages of acquisition documentation. It was 360 and some of it was appendices. She looked at him. Ryan, your board is about to try to pull the deal. I know. They're going to argue that your current PR situation creates deal risk. They're going to say the Davenport shareholders will use it as a pressure point in the final negotiation. I know that too. Do you know that they're wrong? She watched his face. The Davenport shareholders haven't moved. I checked the filing updates this morning. There's been no communication from their side indicating any revised position. The board is reacting to a narrative, not to a business reality. He looked at her. How do you know about the Davenport shareholders, he said. Public filings? She paused. And I called an analyst contact at Mercer who covers the sector. You called? He stopped. Emily, you called an analyst. At 7 this morning. He owed me a favor from a deposition prep 2 years ago. She watched his face, which was doing something complicated. I know it's your deal. I know you didn't ask me to do this, but I read the documentation and it's a good deal, Ryan. It's a genuinely good deal, and it would be a mistake to let your board kill it because of a 3-week-old news cycle. He was quiet for a long moment. Why? He said. Because it's my... She stopped herself. Because it's the right call. He looked at her with an expression she didn't fully know how to read yet. There were still parts of his face she hadn't mapped, things that moved across it too quickly or too quietly to catch. Come to the meeting, he said. Ryan, I'm not... You know the deal. You know the argument. And you are... He paused again, with that same frustrated at himself quality he'd had on the terrace at Greenwich. You are significantly clearer than I am right now. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Okay, she said, but I'm not there as your fiancé. I'm there as your legal counsel. You're not my legal counsel. I'm a lawyer. You've retained me under contract. That's close enough for this morning. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. You're impossible, he said. I've been told. She picked up her bag. Let's go. The boardroom was on the 47th floor and it smelled, as boardrooms always did, of climate-controlled air and barely contained tension. 12 men and women around a long table, most of them over 50, most of them looking at Ryan with the careful, measuring attention of people who have money invested and are currently worried about it. Gerald was there. Of course Gerald was there. Ryan introduced Emily briefly, simply. His attorney, present for the discussion, and she could see the recalibration happening around the table. The fiancé was also a lawyer, which was either reassuring or concerning depending on which version of the story you were telling yourself about Ryan Carter's judgment. The board's arguments came quickly and in the order she'd anticipated. The PR situation created reputational risk. The Davenport shareholders could use the noise as leverage in the final stages. The timeline for close was aggressive under normal circumstances, and these were not normal circumstances. She let them finish. Then she stood up. The Davenport shareholders haven't communicated any revised position in 17 days, she said. I'd like someone at this table to show me a single document, email, phone record, anything that suggests they're planning to use the current press coverage as a negotiating lever. Silence. Because I looked at every public filing from their side in the last 3 weeks, and I spoke this morning with a sector analyst who tracks their shareholder communications, and there is no signal, none, that they're preparing to reprice. She let that sit for a moment. What I do see is a board reacting to a news cycle that is already fading. The story about Mr. Carter's personal life peaked 11 days ago. The stock has recovered 60% of its initial drop, and you're about to recommend killing a $4 billion acquisition that Carter Global has spent 18 months building because of a week of bad press that is already in the rearview mirror. Gerald was looking at her. You're saying we're being reactive. I'm saying the business case for this deal hasn't changed. And if this board pulls out of Davenport now, the message you send to every potential partner in your pipeline is that Carter Global's commitment is contingent on its CEO's personal life staying clean. She paused. That is a much worse long-term problem than anything currently in the news. The room was quiet. She sat back down. Across the table, a woman named Christine Park, 61, the board's longest-serving member, who had said nothing until now, looked at Emily for a long moment. Walk us through the liability exposure if we proceed, Christine said. Not a challenge, a question, a real one. Emily talked for 20 minutes. She knew the documentation, she knew the structure, and she had spent the previous evening building the argument with the focus she brought to complicated cases, the kind where the law was clear but the room wasn't. When she finished, Christine nodded once, slowly. The board voted to proceed with the Davenport acquisition 7-5. It was not a landslide. 5 people still said no, and those 5 people had reasons, and Ryan would need to manage them for the next 30 days through close. But 7-5 was enough. Walking out of the boardroom, Ryan said nothing until they were in the elevator. Then he said, "You knew Christine would be the one to ask." "She's the one who actually reads the filings," Emily said. "I looked up her background. She was a corporate attorney before she joined the board. You researched the board members." "I researched the room I was walking into." "Emily." He said her name with a kind of weight that hadn't been there before. "It's what I do," she said simply. He looked at her in the ascending elevator. The gold light, the quiet hum, the 47 floors of distance between them and the rest of the world. He looked at her like he was working something out. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked forward again at the closed doors. "Just thank you." She thought about telling him it was part of the arrangement. She thought about reminding him that she was being paid $2 million to be useful to him in exactly this kind of situation. She said, "You're welcome." Not son. The weeks that followed were not easy. Ease was not, Emily was learning, a characteristic of this situation, but they found a rhythm. The morning briefings that had become less about coordination and more about something that functioned like actual conversation. The Thursday lunches at a small Italian place on 52nd Street that Marcus had originally scheduled as a public appearance and that they kept going back to because the food was genuinely good. The evening phone calls that had started as logistical check-ins and increasingly ran long, going past the point where there was any practical reason to keep talking. She learned things about him that weren't in any article. That he cooked breakfast himself every morning because he didn't trust anyone else to do it right. And that his definition of right was calibrated entirely to Lily's very specific preferences. That he read fiction at night, actual fiction, literary novels, things with no obvious business application, and had strong opinions about them that he was oddly shy about sharing, as if having feelings about books was somehow inconsistent with his public image. That he had grown up in this family of enormous wealth and enormous expectation, and had spent his 20s performing certainty even when he felt none of it, building a professional persona so sturdy and self-contained that it had, over time, become the thing that kept people at a distance rather than what impressed them. She learned that he laughed differently when he was genuinely amused than when he was being socially appropriate. The real laugh was quieter. It came up slower. It involved a specific crinkle at the corner of one eye. She was not keeping track of these things. She was simply noticing them, the way you notice the particular slant of light in a room you'd been spending time in. Involuntary, almost unconscious. But she noticed. He was learning things about her too. She could tell by the way the morning briefings changed. The questions he asked were less general, more specific, aimed at things she'd mentioned in passing and which she hadn't expected him to retain. He knew about Diane, her best friend, and the person most likely to appear unexpectedly in her life and complicate things. He knew about the cases she found hardest, not the most legally complex ones, but the ones where the human damage was most visible. He knew that she made better decisions when she'd eaten breakfast and worse ones when she hadn't slept. And at some point, he'd started making sure there was coffee and something real to eat at their morning meetings. Not because it was in any document, just because he'd noticed. She told herself this was practical. He needed her functioning at a high level. It made sense. She told herself that several times. Lily made her decision on a Saturday afternoon, which was 3.5 weeks in Ryan's kitchen. Emily had come to the apartment to return some documents she could have emailed, but Ryan had mentioned casually that Lily had a half day and that he was trying to work while she was home and finding it difficult. And Emily had made what she later described to Diane as a logistical decision to drop them off in person. She found Lily at the kitchen table with a set of colored pencils and what appeared to be a very ambitious drawing project, and Ryan somewhere down the hallway behind a closed door doing something that sounded like a tense phone call. "Hi," Emily said, from the kitchen doorway. Lily looked up. She looked at Emily with the full assessing weight of her dark eyes, and then she looked back at her drawing, and then she said, "Do you know how to draw a horse that's actually running? Not standing still, running." Emily came into the kitchen. She set the folder on the counter and sat down across the table. "Show me what you have," she said. Lily turned the paper around. The horse was enthusiastic. The legs were going in directions that legs didn't actually go, and the mane was enormous, and it was clearly in motion of some kind, though what kind was open to interpretation. "The legs are the problem," Lily said, with a frankness Emily found immediately endearing. "I can't get them right. Can I try something?" Emily held out her hand for a pencil. Lily gave her one, green, which she apparently felt was appropriate for a horse, and slid the paper over. Emily was not a talented visual artist. She was aware of this, but she'd done enough procedural diagramming in legal work to understand spatial reasoning, and she knew the basics of how a horse moved because she'd once done depositions for an equine insurance case that had required her to understand gait patterns in more detail than she'd ever anticipated needing. She drew a quick, rough sequence, 4 positions, like a simple animation, showing how the legs moved in a running stride. Lily leaned over and studied it. "Oh," she said. "They move in pairs," Emily said, "but not the pairs you'd expect. The front left and back right move together, and then the front right and back left." Lily picked up her pencil. She made 3 careful adjustments to her drawing. She held it up. The horse was still enthusiastic, and the mane was still enormous. But something about the legs was different now. Some essential quality of motion had appeared that hadn't been there before. "That's better," Lily said, with the satisfaction of someone whose standards are high and who is not generous with acknowledgement. "Much better," Emily agreed. Lily looked at her drawing for another moment. Then she looked at Emily. "My dad makes bad sandwiches," she said. Emily blinked. "I'm sorry?" "He cuts them in triangles because I said triangles taste better, but he cuts them wrong. The diagonal goes the wrong way." She tilted her head. "Do you think that matters? Or does it only matter that he tries?" Emily looked at this 6-year-old sitting across from her with the colored pencils and the horse drawing and the absolutely enormous question she'd just asked. Enormous in the way that only children could make things enormous, by asking them without armor. "I think," Emily said carefully, "that the fact he remembers you like triangles, and that he thinks about it every morning when he makes your lunch, that matters more than the direction of the diagonal." Lily thought about this. "Yeah," she said. "I think so too." She picked up a red pencil and began adding something to her drawing. "He smiles more when you're here," she said without looking up. Emily was quiet. "I thought you should know," Lily said. From down the hallway, the sound of the call ending, the click of a door. Emily looked at the drawing, the horse with the mane and the corrected legs, and felt something that she was not going to look at directly, not right now, not in this kitchen on a Saturday afternoon. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." Lily nodded, businesslike. "Do you want to draw something? You can use the orange pencil. I don't need it right now." Emily picked up the orange pencil. Ryan appeared in the kitchen doorway a minute later, took in the scene. His daughter, and the woman who was supposed to be a temporary arrangement both bent over a piece of paper with colored pencils and said nothing for a moment. "What are you two doing?" he finally said. "Drawing," Lily said without looking up. "I see that." He came further into the kitchen, and Emily didn't look up either, and he stood over them for a moment looking at the horse with the corrected legs. "The legs are better," he said. "Emily helped," Lily said. "She knows things about horses." "Does she?" His voice was warm in a way that was different from any version of his voice Emily had heard in a boardroom, or a briefing, or a carefully staged public appearance. Just warm, simply warm, the particular tone of a parent who is watching something good happen to their child. Emily looked up then, and he was looking at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I should go," she said. "Stay for dinner," he said at the same time. Lily's head came up immediately, tracking between them. Emily looked at Ryan. He was not performing. She had gotten good enough at reading him to know the difference. "Okay," she said. It was pasta. He added too much garlic. He did it because she'd mentioned weeks ago in a morning briefing that it had run too long, that her mother had always cooked with too much garlic, and it was the first thing that had ever made her feel like home. She hadn't thought he was listening. She thought about that for a long time afterward. Done. The month turned. November became December, and the Davenport deal moved toward close, and the board stopped making emergency calls, and the press narrative settled into the comfortable, mildly obsessive shape of a celebrity love story in which the public had decided they were rooting for Ryan Carter to get his life together. And underneath all of it, slowly and without either of them naming it, something else was happening. Not a performance anymore. Not exactly. Emily knew it the night she was on the phone with Diane at 11:30, sitting on her own couch in Washington Heights, and Diane said very carefully, "Emily, are you falling for him?" And Emily sat with the phone pressed against her cheek and the quiet of her apartment around her and her mother's plants on the windowsill, and she said nothing for long enough that Diane had her answer. "Emily, it's complicated. That's not a no. It's an arrangement, Diane. It's a contract. He made you pasta with too much garlic. That's not... Emily, he made you pasta with too much garlic." She pressed her fingers against her forehead. "I know. So what are you going to do?" She looked at her mother's calendar on the wall. December, 2 months left in the arrangement. "I'm going to be very careful," she said. Diane was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to be careful," she said gently. "You're already not being careful." Emily didn't answer that. She looked at the plants and the calendar and the ordinary careful life she had built in this apartment, and thought about how she was going to manage the next 2 months without doing something she couldn't undo. She did not, in the quiet and the honesty of 11:30 on a Tuesday night, believe herself. Being careful, Emily discovered, was significantly harder in practice than in theory. She had been careful for most of her adult life. Careful about money, careful about expectations, careful about the precise amount of herself she gave to people who might not give the same back. Careful was how she'd gotten through law school on 2 jobs and a prayer. Careful was how she'd built a client list from nothing. Careful was the entire architecture of the life she'd constructed, brick by careful brick, in a city that would eat you alive if you stopped paying attention. So she knew how to be careful. She was an expert at it. What she was not an expert at was being careful about a person who kept doing things like remembering the garlic or leaving a cup of coffee on the corner of the conference table at exactly the moment she needed it, or looking at her across a room full of powerful people with an expression that said, without words, that she was the only thing in that room he actually trusted. December arrived with the particular cold of a New York winter that had decided not to ease into itself. Just a hard turn, one morning, from bearable to biting, and Emily made the commute in her heaviest coat and thought about the charity gala that Marcus had put on the calendar for the 15th, the Meridian Foundation Gala. Black tie. 500 of Manhattan's wealthiest residents. Live coverage on 2 entertainment channels, and a social media strategy that Marcus had described with genuine professional pride as the culmination of the narrative arc. "It's the last major public event before the board reconvenes to finalize the Davenport close," Marcus had explained the week before, spreading event materials across the conference room table with the enthusiasm of a general presenting a battle plan. "If Ryan and Emily walk into that room together, and he'd gestured expressively. "If they're convincing, it closes the story. Happy couple, stable man, no more questions." "We've been convincing," Ryan said from the end of the table. You've been convincing in small rooms and staged lunches, Marcus said. This is 500 people, live cameras, and a room that includes 3 members of your board, 2 Davenport executives, and He paused. Victoria. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Emily looked at Ryan. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A subtle tightening, a reorganization. She confirmed, he said, last week. She's bringing her new... Marcus seemed to weigh his words. She's not coming alone. Of course she's not, Ryan said quietly, and Emily couldn't tell if it was resignation or something else. After Marcus left, Emily sat across from Ryan in the empty conference room and said, "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." "Ryan, I'm fine." He was already gathering papers. "It's a gala. We've done galas." "We've done one gala," she said, and it was a relatively low-stakes one where no one was actively hostile to us in the room. He stopped gathering papers. He set them back down. He looked at the table for a moment in that way he had, the extended pause that meant he was actually thinking rather than performing thoughtfulness. "Victoria and I..." He stopped, started again. "What I told the press, what I've allowed people to believe, it's not entirely accurate. The situation was more complicated than cheating. I didn't handle it well." He looked up then. "I'm not saying she was wrong to be angry. I'm saying it's going to be complicated, that room." Emily looked at him. "What happened?" "Actually happened." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Her father and my board arranged the engagement," he said. "I knew that going in. She knew that going in. We were pragmatic about it, or we thought we were." He looked at the middle distance. "And then I met someone. Not seriously. It was 3 or 4 months in, and it was wrong, and I ended it. But Victoria found out, and He exhaled. She'd started believing it was real, despite everything we'd agreed at the beginning. She'd started to believe we were actually building something, and then found out He stopped. "I should have been more honest with her earlier, about what I was and wasn't feeling." Emily held that carefully. "And were you honest with yourself about it?" He looked at her, a long, direct look. "No," he said. "Probably not." She thought about the contract in the drawer of her desk, about $2 million and a 3-month timeline and the word arrangement. She thought about honesty and what it cost, and whether she was currently being as honest with herself as she was requiring him to be. "Okay," she said. "Okay, thank you for telling me." She picked up her pen. "Now, let's talk about the gala." The dress was midnight blue. She hadn't planned it that way. She'd gone to the appointment that Marcus had arranged with a stylist with the specific intention of choosing something that was appropriate and professional and would read well on camera, which meant conservative and tasteful and forgettable in all the right ways. She'd been in the appointment for 40 minutes and had been on the verge of selecting a perfectly acceptable black gown when the stylist had brought out the midnight blue one, off-shoulder, structured at the bodice, with a quality of fabric that caught light in a way that was hard to describe and impossible to ignore. She'd said no 3 times. Then she'd put it on. She didn't see Ryan's expression when she came down the steps of her building on the night of the gala, because she was watching her footing on the wet December steps and making sure she didn't do anything embarrassing in the heels that were also the stylist's fault. But she felt it, the particular quality of a silence that meant something. She looked up. He was standing beside the car. He'd sent George home and driven himself, which she'd learned was what he did when he needed to feel in control of something. He was in a tuxedo that fit him with the uncomplicated ease of a man who had been wearing them since adolescence, and he was looking at her with an expression that he didn't manage to organize quickly enough. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to say something." "I was going to say you look..." "I know what you were going to say." She reached the bottom of the steps. She could feel the cold, and under that, something warmer, something she was being careful about. "Don't." He opened the car door. He was quiet until she was inside, and then he got in on his side, and they drove in silence for a minute. And then he said, "You look exceptional. I'm going to say that once, and not again if you'd prefer, but I needed it on the record." She looked out the window at the December city sliding past. The lights, the wet pavement, the particular beautiful harshness of New York in winter. "Okay," she said. Okay? It's on the record. She did not look at him. Drive. He drove. She could see in her peripheral vision that he was almost smiling. The Meridian Foundation Gala occupied the entire ballroom of the Aldridge Hotel, which was the kind of venue that justified its own mythology. Soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, the accumulated history of 50 years of Manhattan's most significant events. A room that had seen presidents and Nobel laureates and at least 2 scandals that had changed the direction of major institutions. It was also, Emily thought as they walked in, the most intimidating single room she had ever entered. And she had entered some genuinely intimidating rooms. The crowd was dense and beautifully dressed and loud, with the particular noise of 500 wealthy people in a confined space. A sound that was simultaneously festive and predatory, champagne and competition. Cameras were positioned at the entrance because, of course, they were. And the moment Ryan and Emily came through the doors, the lenses found them with the focused attention of things that have been waiting. She took his arm without thinking about it. It was automatic by now. The physical language of a couple that she'd had to practice and that had, at some point, stopped feeling like practice. He covered her hand with his, briefly, just for a second, in a way that was not for the cameras. She noticed. She was noticing everything, which was part of the problem. The first hour was manageable. They moved through the room in the way they'd learned to move through rooms together, close enough to suggest intimacy, separate enough to have their own conversations, reconnecting at intervals with the ease of people who know where the other one is without having to check. She talked to Christine Park, who was unexpectedly warm outside a boardroom. She talked to 2 of the Davenport executives who seemed reassured by her presence in ways that Marcus would have called a narrative win. She drank 1 glass of champagne slowly and thought about how she would describe this evening to Diane, which was a thing she did in difficult situations. Narrated them in advance to an imagined Diane, which helped her keep the situation at the necessary clinical distance. Diane in her head said, "You look like you belong here." Real Emily said, "That's the point." Diane in her head said, "I don't mean at the gala." She ended that internal conversation. Ryan found her near the edge of the room at the 40-minute mark. He'd been pulled into what looked like a board conversation for the previous 20 minutes, and she'd watched him across the room. Not consistently, not obviously, just the way you tracked a person you were supposed to be attached to. "Surviving," he said quietly, arriving beside her. "Thriving," she said. "I just had a genuinely interesting conversation about infrastructure bonds." "With who?" "The woman in the green dress. Turns out she's the CFO of the Meridian Foundation, and she has strong opinions about municipal debt structures that I found unexpectedly compelling." He looked at her. "Only you," he said. "What?" "Only you would find the one person in this room who wants to talk about bonds and consider it a highlight." It was a good conversation. She sipped her champagne. "How was the board corner?" "Manageable." He shifted slightly, so they were standing closer. Another thing that had stopped being performance and started being geography, the natural distance they defaulted to when they were together. "Gerald is coming around. I think Christine talked to him." "Christine is smart." "You told her that to her face, by the way, in the boardroom." "I did not." "You basically did." He glanced sideways at her. "She mentioned it. She said..." He paused, something moving through his expression. "She said she hoped the board had been difficult enough for you to want to come back." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Come back?" "She was implying..." He stopped, started again. "She was implying that you'd have a future there, in a professional capacity, if you wanted it." The sentence had a shape that Emily felt but didn't look at directly. Professional capacity, if you wanted it. As if the question of what she might want going forward in relation to Carter Global was one that someone other than the 2 of them had already begun to consider. She pulled back from wherever that was going. "That's not something we need to think about right now." "No," he agreed. "Right now we need to survive the next 2 hours." He was right about that. What he didn't know, and what Emily was about to find out, was that the next 2 hours had already organized themselves into something significantly more complicated than either of them had planned for. Victoria Ashworth arrived at the 45-minute mark, and the room knew it immediately. It was the specific quality of a crowd when someone enters who changes the atmospheric pressure. A subtle reorganization, a directional shift in where people were looking. Emily felt it before she saw it, that change in the room's attention, and she turned and saw Victoria across the ballroom. She was striking. Emily had seen the photographs, but photographs hadn't fully prepared her for the reality. Victoria Ashworth, in person, was the kind of beautiful that arrived with full awareness of itself, tall and precise in a red gown that was clearly designed to be the color that stood out most dramatically in any room. She had the composure of someone who had grown up at events exactly like this one, and who had never, not once, worried about whether she belonged. She was looking directly at Ryan. Beside Emily, she felt Ryan's arm shift slightly. A small, involuntary tension, there and then controlled. "I see her," he said quietly. "I know. Are you—" "I'm fine." She meant it. "Are you?" A beat. "Working on it." Victoria moved through the room with a group of people Emily didn't recognize. And yes, she was not alone. There was a man beside her, handsome in the practiced way of men who understand their handsomeness as a resource. She made no immediate move toward Ryan and Emily. She circulated. She was seen. She let the room understand that she was here and comfortable, and that this was, for her, simply another evening in a long sequence of evenings exactly like it. Emily watched her and felt something that surprised her. Not jealousy exactly, or not only that, but something more uncomfortable. Recognition. The recognition of a woman who had learned to perform composure in rooms that were not built for her, and who could see with some specificity how that was done. Victoria had been performing this for 30 years. She was very good at it, and underneath the performance, Emily suspected, though she could not know this, had no right to know this, there was someone who had genuinely believed something was real and had been wrong, and who had made the choice to be devastated loudly rather than quietly. Emily couldn't entirely blame her for that. The confrontation came at the 90-minute mark, which in retrospect Emily thought was tactically well-timed, late enough that the champagne had made the crowd generous and attentive, early enough that it would be tomorrow's story rather than tonight's end. They were near the center of the room. Ryan had been drawn into a conversation with one of the Davenport men, a senior executive named Hargrove, who seemed to require reassurance at regular intervals, and Emily was beside him, mostly listening, when she became aware of Victoria approaching from the left. Not rushing, walking. The deliberate, measured walk of someone who has decided what they're going to do and intends to do it thoroughly. Emily saw her first. She placed a light hand on Ryan's arm, not dramatically, just a touch, the kind that carried information, and she felt him understand it immediately. He turned slightly. Victoria stopped 3 feet away from them, which was the distance that made it a conversation rather than a confrontation, except that everyone within 12 feet of them could hear it, and several people were already oriented toward it with the half-attention of a crowd that senses something is about to happen. "Ryan," Victoria said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. It was the voice of someone who has rehearsed this moment and is executing it exactly. "Victoria." He said her name with the same careful register. "You look well." "I do." A fractional pause. Her eyes moved to Emily, direct, assessing, without pretense. "And you must be Emily." "I am, son," Emily said. "I've read about you." Victoria's tone was neutral in the specific way of neutral that contains a great deal of information. "You came out of nowhere rather quickly." "People usually do," Emily said. "Before they're somewhere. A beat." Something moved in Victoria's eyes, not anger, something more complex. "Charming." She looked back at Ryan. "I need a minute." "Victoria, Not a scene, Ryan. Just a minute. There are things I'd like to say without an audience." She glanced pointedly at Hargrove, who was doing an impressive impression of someone who was not listening. "Unless you'd prefer to have them here." Ryan was quiet for a moment. He looked at Emily. She gave him the smallest nod. She meant, "Go." She meant, "You owe her this." She meant, "I'll be here." He went. Emily watched them move to the edge of the room, finding a quieter alcove near the far wall. She watched Victoria's hands, still, controlled, but with a quality of held tension that Emily recognized. She watched Ryan's posture, open, not defensive, the posture of a man who is accepting something rather than arguing against it. Hargrove drifted away with the social grace of someone who understood this was his cue to be elsewhere. Emily stood near the edge of the room and didn't watch Ryan and Victoria, or tried not to, and failed, because it turned out being careful had limits. Diana appeared beside her, as she had a talent for doing. She planned that, Diana said quietly, without preamble. I know. She's not a villain. I want you to know that. Diana was watching the alcove too. She was genuinely hurt. She handled it the way she handles things, publicly, loudly, with maximum tactical advantage. But the hurt was real. I know, Emily said again. Does that bother you? Emily thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, but not in the way you might think. Diana was quiet for a moment. How then? Because I understand it. Emily watched Ryan across the room, his profile, the way he was listening, believing something is real when it's actually structured differently, realizing the gap between what you thought and what was actually true. She paused. I understand what that costs. Diana turned to look at her fully. Something shifted in her expression, a kind of careful attention that hadn't been there before. Emily, she said slowly. Don't. Emily kept her voice level. I'm fine. You don't look... Diana. She finally turned from the alcove. I promise I'm fine. Diana looked at her for a long moment with the particular, thorough attention of someone who did not believe her at all but was choosing, for now, to accept it. Ryan came back 5 minutes later. He came directly to her, which she noticed, the way she was noticing everything tonight, cataloging it against her better judgment. Okay? She said quietly. Yeah. He exhaled, the long, controlled exhale of something set down. She said what she needed to say. I deserved most of it. He paused. He seemed to be selecting words carefully. She's going to be fine. She's already more fine than she's been letting on. Emily nodded. Thank you for... He stopped, looked at her. For the nod. For knowing I needed to go. You did? She said simply. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that she'd stopped being able to categorize neatly, something that fell outside the system she'd been using to organize her understanding of Ryan Carter. Before either of them could say anything else, the room began its shift toward the main event of the evening. The formal portion, the speeches, the live segment hosted by the Foundation's MC that everyone here had been navigating around for the past hour and a half. Tables filled, the lights adjusted. The crowd organized itself into the shape of an audience. Ryan and Emily found their table, front left, a position Marcus had selected with the care of a chess player. The Davenport executives were across the room. Gerald and Christine were 3 tables over. Victoria had moved to the opposite side of the ballroom entirely, and Emily tried not to track where, and mostly succeeded. The MC was a man named Bradley who had the particular energy of television hosts who are hired specifically for events like this. Smooth, warm, capable of making 500 people feel simultaneously seen and gently manipulated into generosity. He opened the formal portion with a few words about the Foundation's work, then moved into the segment that everyone understood was the real reason the cameras were positioned where they were. Manhattan has had no shortage of love stories this fall, Bradley said, with the practiced warmth of someone who has done his research, but I think it's fair to say that the most talked about couple in this room tonight might be... He paused, with the timing of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. Ryan Carter and Emily Hayes. The room's attention consolidated, the way it always did when a large group of people agreed simultaneously on where to look. Emily kept her expression easy. She had done this before. She could do this. We've heard a lot about this relationship over the past several weeks, Bradley continued, approaching their table with his microphone and his comfortable smile. But we haven't heard it from the source, so, Ryan, he gestured with the microphone, tell us. How did this begin? Ryan leaned slightly forward. He told the story, the lobby, the chaos, the accidental meeting, framed as the romantic collision that Marcus had shaped it into, and he told it well with the ease of someone who had told it enough times that the shape of it was natural. Emily listened to it and noticed, as she often did, the places where the true things were and the places where the framing covered them. And the proposal? Bradley said, leaning in with the conspiratorial delight of a man about to get exactly what he came for. Because our audience has been dying to know, and how did that happen? Emily felt Ryan go still beside her. A fraction of a second. Almost nothing, but she felt it. Because the proposal, in any real sense, hadn't happened. There was no story. Marcus had been careful never to be specific about it in the press materials because the specifics didn't exist. It was the one corner of the narrative that had remained deliberately vague, and now a man with a microphone and 500 witnesses was asking for it directly. Emily turned slightly toward Ryan, and she saw it. The precise moment when he made his decision, the shift from calculating an exit strategy to doing something else entirely. She saw it in his eyes first, a kind of clarity, sudden and resolute, the expression of a man who has been managing and performing and calculating for so long that the decision to stop was itself disorienting. He put down his champagne glass. He pushed back his chair. The room made a sound, not words, something beneath words, the collective intake of breath of 500 people who understood simultaneously what they were about to watch. Ryan Carter got down on one knee. Emily's heart stopped, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. There was a moment where everything in her chest simply halted, her breath, her carefully maintained composure, the entire constructed architecture of being careful. And she was left with nothing but the present moment, the midnight blue dress, and the chandelier light, and this man on one knee looking up at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not performance. She knew performance by now. She knew the particular quality of Ryan Carter presenting something to a room versus Ryan Carter actually being somewhere. This was the second thing. "I don't have a speech," he said, and his voice carried in the absolute silence of the room without him having to raise it. "I'm not—" He paused, and the pause was real, not calculated. "I'm not good at saying things that aren't about work. You've told me that. More than once." A beat, something moving through his face. "But you walked into my lobby 11 weeks ago and you changed everything. And I know this isn't—" He stopped, looked at her. "I know this is a lot. I know it's in front of 500 people. I know you're going to have thoughts about this." The ghost of something, not quite a smile. "You always have thoughts." The room was so quiet she could hear the chandeliers. He reached into his jacket pocket. A ring. She would think later, trying to reconstruct the moment, that the ring was not what she'd been expecting. Not an enormous statement. Not something designed to photograph well. A single diamond, clean set. The kind of thing that looked like it had been chosen by someone who thought about what she would actually want to wear every day. "Emily Hayes," he said. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him. She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. At the dark circles she'd stopped noticing because they'd become part of him. At the jaw that carried tension in a way she now recognized as his specific form of it. At the eyes that were exhausted and careful, and underneath all of it, completely open in a way she'd seen build slowly over 11 weeks. The room waited. She was supposed to say yes. That was the arrangement. That was the narrative. 500 people and 3 cameras, and Marcus somewhere in this room were all anticipating yes. And yes was the correct move, the planned move, the move that served the story they'd been building. She said yes. But here was the thing that she would spend the next several days turning over and examining from every angle, because it was the kind of thing that required examination. It didn't feel like a planned move. It felt like an answer. He slid the ring on her finger. He stood. The room erupted. Applause, that particular warm sound of 500 people who have just witnessed something they are choosing to believe in, and in the noise and the cameras and the absolute surreal brightness of that moment, Ryan leaned down close to her ear. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Later. Not here." She nodded, once, without turning toward him. "The ring," he said, very quietly. "It wasn't from Marcus's office." She turned then. He was looking at her with an expression that said the rest of it. The things that wouldn't fit in a ballroom, that needed a different kind of room, a quieter one without cameras. Bradley was saying something warm and congratulatory into his microphone, and the table was being approached by well-wishers, and Emily smiled and said the right things and held Ryan's arm and did all the things the situation required of her. But her heart was doing something she hadn't authorized it to do. The bathroom off the main corridor was empty, which she found by accident 20 minutes later when the well-wishing had temporarily crested and she needed 30 seconds of silence. She stood in front of the mirror with the ring on her finger. This ring that hadn't come from Marcus's office, that hadn't been planned, that existed in some category she hadn't yet found the right word for. And she looked at herself and said out loud to her own reflection in the empty marble quiet, "Oh no," because there it was. The thing she'd been not looking at directly for weeks. The thing that Diane had named at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. The thing that she'd told herself she could manage. She was in love with him, not with the billionaire, not with the narrative of Ryan Carter that 500 people in the next room had just applauded, with the man who made sandwiches cut in the wrong diagonal and left coffee on tables and admitted quietly in conference rooms that he hadn't been honest with himself, with the man who listened, with the tired, complicated, imperfect person who had asked her with a shaking voice. She'd felt it, the slight tremor in his hand when he'd put the ring on her finger. Not to play a role, but to answer a question. She looked at her reflection for a long moment. Then she washed her hands, fixed her expression, and went back out into the ballroom. She was going to be fine. She was absolutely, completely terrified. The confrontation she hadn't anticipated came at the coat check. She'd slipped away while Ryan was occupied with a conversation near the bar. She could see him across the room, the back of his head, the particular set of his shoulders that meant he was listening carefully to something he'd rather not be hearing. And she was waiting for her coat when Victoria appeared beside her. Not with the controlled approach of earlier, just beside her. Two women waiting for coats at the end of the evening. Emily turned her head. She didn't reach for composure because the composure was just there, automatic, the deep down kind. "He chose well," Victoria said. It was not what Emily expected. She was quiet for a moment. "Victoria, I'm not going to make a speech," Victoria said. She was looking at the coat check window, not at Emily. "I said what I had to say to him earlier, and I meant most of it." A pause. "But I spent 6 months being angry at you for existing before I'd ever met you, which I've recently decided is a waste of time." Emily said nothing. "You argued for the Davenport deal in that board meeting," Victoria said. 3 people on that board called me to mention it, not to gossip, to say they were impressed." She glanced sideways at Emily then, just briefly. "You know that 1/3 of those companies would collapse without strong representation in those rooms." "I know," Emily said. "You were there as his fiancée," Victoria said, "but you argued that case as yourself." "I'm always myself," Emily said, and then wondered why that had come out like a defense. Victoria's coat arrived. She took it, put it over her arm, and for a moment she stood there with the particular quality of someone about to say something they've decided to say regardless of the response. "He looks at you differently," she said, not unkindly. "He never looked at me like that. I told myself he would eventually. That was probably my mistake." She paused. "Don't make the same one in reverse." Emily looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Victoria seemed to choose her words with care. "I convinced myself that what we had was real when the structure was false. Just make sure you're not convincing yourself the structure is false when what's real is actually—" She stopped, gave a small, dry, slightly painful smile. "You're a lawyer. You know how to read the actual terms." She left. Emily stood at the coat check with her heart in her throat, holding someone else's perceptiveness about her own situation, which was an extremely uncomfortable place to be. Her coat arrived. She put it on. She stood in the lobby of the Aldridge Hotel in the midnight blue dress and the ring that hadn't come from Marcus's office. And she thought about terms, about what was real, about the difference between a structure that was false and a feeling that wasn't. She thought about what Ryan had said. "I need to talk to you, later, not here." She pulled out her phone. She texted him, "I'm in the lobby, whenever you're ready." His response came 90 seconds later. "Don't leave?" She didn't. What? They drove for a while without a destination, because Ryan had said, "Can we just drive for a minute?" And she'd said yes, and George had taken them into the quiet December streets of Manhattan at 11 o'clock, the city doing what it did at night. Less frenetic, more honest, the avenues wide and lit and emptied of their daytime pretense. She didn't push. She'd learned that Ryan said things in his own time, that pressing him produced less rather than more, and she'd learned this the way she learned everything about him, by watching, by cataloging, by paying the kind of attention she usually reserved for cases. He broke first, which also felt characteristic. "The ring," he said. "I bought it 3 weeks ago." She looked at him. "Before the gala was confirmed," he said, "before Marcus put the proposal on the schedule as a possibility." He was looking out the front window, at the city. "I bought it because I wanted to, and then I talked myself out of it being real and put it in my desk, and then tonight when Bradley asked the question, He stopped. "I stopped calculating." She was quiet. "I know that's—" He turned to look at her then. I know the arrangement. I know the timeline. I know that in 4 weeks this is supposed to... He stopped again. I'm trying to say something and I'm doing it very badly. You're doing okay, she said. Emily? Ryan? I'm not performing anymore, he said. I don't think I have been for a while. And I need you to know that regardless of what you decide, whatever you want to do with that information, I need it said out loud. So I'm saying it. The car moved through the city. The lights slid past. Emily looked at her hands, the ring catching the streetlight. She thought about a lobby 11 weeks ago and a desperate man and a decision she'd made in 2 seconds that she couldn't undo. She thought about garlic and sandwiches and a little girl with horse drawings and a board meeting and a terrace in Greenwich and the very specific loneliness of 2 people who had been holding their own weight alone for so long that the idea of putting it down somewhere safe felt like falling. I'm scared, she said. Came out quietly, without decoration. I want to be honest with you. I'm scared. Of what? She thought about how to say it. Of the distance between your life and mine being not just money, not just background, but the way it works. The board, the press, the family, all of it. I have spent my whole adult life building something that's entirely mine. My practice, my reputation, she paused, my sense of where I belong. And she stopped. If you what? If I fall into this and it doesn't... She looked at him. If I'm wrong about what you're saying right now, I lose more than the arrangement. He held her eyes. You're not wrong, he said, about what I'm saying. She believed him. That was the terrifying thing. She believed him. Okay, she said. Okay meaning I'm not walking away. She turned to look out the window because looking at him directly was more than she could manage right now. In this car, in this dress, with this ring. Okay, meaning I need some time to figure out how to be brave about this, because I'm apparently out of practice. You are the bravest person I know, he said, and he said it without drama, just as fact, the same way he said things that were simply true. She was quiet for a moment. That's a lot to live up to, she said. You manage, he said. The car moved through the city and they didn't say anything else, and the silence was a different kind than the ones they'd had before. Not managed, not careful, not the controlled quiet of 2 people who were maintaining professional distance. Just 2 people in a car at 11 o'clock in December, with the city lit up around them and something new and frightening and real between them that neither of them quite had the words for yet. She didn't take the ring off. That, she thought, was probably its own kind of answer. She didn't sleep. She'd been awake enough nights in her life to know the difference between the kind of sleeplessness that came from worry and the kind that came from something else entirely. The kind that came from a mind that was too full to shut down, that kept returning to the same moment from different angles, the way you return to something bright that you keep having to look away from. She lay in her apartment in Washington Heights with the ring on her nightstand. She'd taken it off when she got home, not in rejection, just because she needed to look at it from a distance, needed to not be wearing it while she tried to think clearly. And she stared at the ceiling and thought about the car ride home. You're not wrong about what I'm saying. About the way he'd said it, not with the careful precision he used in business, not with the managed delivery of a man presenting an argument, but with the flat, unadorned quality of someone who was just telling the truth because the alternative had become untenable. About the ring sitting 3 feet away on her nightstand, which she was not looking at, and which she was entirely unable to stop thinking about. At 2 a.m, her mother appeared in the bedroom doorway. Margaret Hayes at 61 moved differently than she used to. Slower, more deliberate, the particular careful movement of someone whose body had become something she had to negotiate with. But her eyes were the same as they'd always been, dark and perceptive and missing almost nothing. You're awake, she said. You should be sleeping, Mom. I was sleeping, then I wasn't. Margaret came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed with the careful settling of someone who has learned which positions cause pain and which don't. She looked at the nightstand, at the ring. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Is that new? Margaret asked. It's complicated. Most rings are, in my experience. Margaret looked at her daughter in the dark room with the particular patience of a woman who had waited out a great many things. Do you want to tell me about it? Emily had not, in the 11 weeks of the arrangement, told her mother the full truth. She'd told her about Ryan, carefully, in the version that was public, the version that Marcus had shaped. Her mother had watched the news coverage with the quiet attention she gave most things, and had not pressed, and Emily had been grateful for that. Now she looked at the ceiling and said, "It started as something fake." Margaret was quiet. "I signed a contract," Emily said. "He needed someone to play a role. She stopped. "I needed the money. For your care. For the debt. For all of it." The silence had a quality of her mother thinking. "And now?" Margaret said. Emily turned her head, looked at the ring on the nightstand. "Now I don't know what it is." "What does he say it is?" She thought about the car, the city moving past. "I'm not performing anymore. I don't think I have been for a while." "He says it's real." "What do you say?" "I say I'm scared." Margaret reached over and covered Emily's hand with hers. Her hands were the same as they'd always been. The hands Emily had grown up with, capable and slightly rough and warm in the way that meant safety, the way that certain things meant safety when you'd been holding on to them long enough. "Emily," her mother's voice was the quiet kind, "you have been scared your whole life of wanting things and not getting them, of reaching and falling. You have been afraid of that since you were 8 years old, and you decided that wanting something too much was the most dangerous thing a person could do." Emily said nothing. "Is he a good man?" Margaret asked. She thought about all the things she knew about Ryan Carter that weren't in any article. The wrong diagonal sandwiches, the fiction novels he was shy about, the way he listened, the way he said thank you simply, without decoration, when it cost him something to say it. "Yeah," she said. "He is." "Then be scared," her mother said, "and do it anyway." She patted her hand once and stood up slowly. "The ring is beautiful, by the way." "Mom, I have eyes," Margaret said, and went back to bed. Emily lay in the dark for another hour. Then she got up, put the ring back on her finger, and went to make tea. She wasn't going to resolve anything tonight, but she was also, she realized, done pretending to herself that there was a version of this where she walked away clean. 3 days after the gala, Marcus called to say the coverage had exceeded every metric he'd set. The proposal story had run in 11 outlets. The social media numbers were, in his words, frankly obscene. The board had received the Davenport Close projection with, for the first time in months, no significant objections. "You two are the story," Marcus said on the phone, with the satisfaction of a man who has executed a campaign flawlessly. "Nobody's asking about the old engagement anymore. Nobody's asking about any of it. Ryan Carter is a man in love, and the whole city is rooting for him." "Great," Emily said. "There's one event left on the schedule," Marcus said. "The New Year's Foundation dinner, December 31st. After that, we're into the quiet period. The Davenport Close, the board meeting in January, and then a pause. And then technically the arrangement concludes at the end of January." "Right," Emily said. "Emily." Marcus's voice shifted. He was not, she'd learned, without perceptiveness. He was just usually focused elsewhere. How are you?" "I'm fine, Marcus. Because the ring situation, that wasn't in my plan. I want you to know that. I didn't orchestrate that." "I know." "He went off script entirely. I didn't know until it was happening." Another pause. "I've worked with Ryan for 6 years. I've never seen him go off script." She held the phone against her cheek. Outside her office window, the city was doing its December thing, gray and bright and relentless. "Marcus," she said. "Yeah." "I know." She hung up and sat with that for a while. The conversation they actually needed to have didn't happen that week. It happened in pieces, in the morning briefings that had become something other than briefings, in phone calls that ran past any practical endpoint, in the small daily accumulations of two people who had started in one place and had, without either of them managing it well, arrived somewhere else. What they were avoiding, both of them and in their different ways, was a specific question of what happened in January. What happened when the 3 months were up? What happened to the contract and the arrangement and the $2 million and all the practical scaffolding that had held this thing up while the actual thing underneath it was becoming real? Ryan was avoiding it, she thought, because naming it meant risking it. He had a particular way of holding things carefully when he was afraid of breaking them. She'd seen it with Lily, the way he circled around difficult topics with her, approaching obliquely, not because he was cowardly, but because the stakes were too high to be clumsy. She was avoiding it because she was still, at some fundamental level, the girl from Columbus who had learned that wanting things too loudly was the first step toward losing them. The thing that finally forced the conversation into the open was not the gala, and not Marcus's phone call, and not even the night she'd spent looking at the ceiling with the ring on the nightstand. It was a Thursday afternoon in the second week of December when Emily went to her mother's specialist appointment and came out knowing something she hadn't known going in. The specialist, a careful, precise woman named Dr. Okafor, who had been managing Margaret's case for 2 years, had reviewed the recent blood work and the imaging and had said, in the clear language Emily had always appreciated from her, "I want to talk about the next phase of your mother's care." What Dr. Okafor said next was not catastrophic. It was not the worst thing. But it was the thing that Emily had known was coming in an abstract way and had now become concrete and specific and dated. The kind of information that rearranged your sense of the near future in ways you couldn't immediately process. Margaret's kidneys were declining faster than the previous projections. Not dramatically, not imminently, but steadily and with the kind of medical specificity that meant decisions needed to be made in the next few months about levels of care that were significantly beyond what Emily had been piecing together. She sat in the parking lot of the medical building for 20 minutes afterward, in her car, with the heat running, not quite ready to drive. She called Diane first. Diane said the right things and also said, "You need to tell Ryan," and Emily said, "I know," and hung up. She drove back to her office. She had 2 client meetings in the afternoon. She got through both of them with the focused clarity she'd trained herself to produce on demand, and then she sat at her desk afterward in the quiet of a day that had ended, and she was still sitting there at 6 o'clock when her phone rang. "Ryan, you missed our 4 o'clock," he said when she answered. "I know. I'm sorry." A pause. "Are you at your office?" "Yes." "I'm coming." "Ryan, you don't have to—" "Emily." His voice was even, but not distant. The 2 things were different with him. She'd learned to tell them apart. "I'm coming." He arrived 40 minutes later, which meant he'd driven himself again. She could tell by the time shorter than the car service would have taken. He came into her office without knocking, because she'd texted him the door code 2 months ago for a logistics reason, and neither of them had addressed the fact that he still used it. He stopped inside the door and looked at her. Really looked the way he did when he was assessing rather than performing assessment, and said nothing for a moment. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him the way she told most things that hurt, cleanly, factually, with the structure of a legal deposition that held the emotion at a manageable distance. The appointment, Dr. Okafor. The timeline, what it meant for Margaret's care and for the cost of that care and for the next phase of everything. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, without the reflexive reassurances that most people offered when they were uncomfortable with someone else's difficulty. When she finished, he said, "What do you need?" Not, "I'm sorry," not, "That's awful," not, "Don't worry, we'll figure it out," just, "What do you need?" She had been prepared for sympathy. She had been prepared to hold herself together against the warmth of sympathy, which was usually harder than holding together against cold things. She had not been prepared for the practicality of that question, which landed directly in the place where she was most tired. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'm still processing." He came and sat down across from her desk, not beside her. He seemed to understand she needed the desk between them right now, needed the slight distance. He sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at her. "Can I say something?" he said. "Yes." "The money." He said it carefully, like something he'd been holding and was now setting down. "The 2 million. Whatever you haven't spent, whatever you've saved, it's yours. Fully and unconditionally. Not contingent on anything. I want you to know that. Whatever we figure out going forward." She looked at him. "Ryan, I'm not finished." He held her eyes. "And separately from the money, separately from any of the arrangement or the contract or any of it, I want to help. With your mother. Not because of what we are to each other right now or what we might be, because she's your mother and she matters to you, and that makes her matter to me." He paused. "I know you're going to push back on that." "I am," she said. "I know, but let me finish pushing first." Something moved in his face, the frustration at himself quality that she'd come to recognize as one of his tells. "I have resources. I'm not saying it to make you feel lesser, or to make myself feel useful, or to—" He stopped, started again. "Emily, I have been watching you hold every single thing in your life alone for 3 months. Your job, your mother, the arrangement, everything. And I know you know how to do that. I know it's what you've always done. But you don't have to do it alone because I'm here, and I'm choosing to be here, and I need you to let me mean that. The office was very quiet. Outside, the city hummed its constant low note. That speech, she said finally, was significantly better than the one at the gala. His exhale was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him all week. I had 3 days to think about it. It shows. She looked at the desk, at her hands, at the ring that she was still wearing, that she'd been wearing every day since the gala, that she hadn't discussed, and neither had he. I'm not good at being helped, she said. I know. I've been doing everything alone since I was 22, and my mother's health first started. And I built the whole shape of my life around managing it myself. And the idea of leaning on someone for any of it feels, she searched for the word, dangerous. It feels dangerous. Because if the person isn't there, then, Emily, she looked up. I'm not going anywhere, he said. That's what I need you to hear. Not as a reassurance, not as a line, as a fact. He held her gaze. I know the arrangement has a timeline. I know January was supposed to be an endpoint. I am telling you clearly and specifically that it is not an endpoint for me, and I would like very much for it not to be an endpoint for you either. The silence was the kind that had weight and shape and was not uncomfortable. Okay, she said. He waited. I need time, she said. Not because I don't... She stopped. Not because the answer is no, but because I need to do this in the right order. My mother first, what she needs, figuring out the care, making those decisions, and then she looked at him. And then we talk about this, properly. How long? A few weeks. I'll know more after I talk to Dr. Okafor again next week. He nodded. Okay. He stood. I meant what I said about the care. Please let me help with that part. You don't have to decide anything else to let me help with that. She looked at him standing in her office, this man who had started as the most inconvenient thing that had ever happened to her Thursday morning, and felt the full weight of how comprehensively she had failed at being careful. Ryan, she said. Yeah, I know it's real. For me too. I just needed you to know that I know. He stood very still for a moment. Okay, he said quietly, and this okay was the mirror of hers from the car. Not a dismissal. An arrival. He left. She sat in her office for a while longer and thought about the particular irony of being a person who argued other people's cases for a living and who had spent 3 months arguing herself out of the most obvious thing in the room. And see. The third week of December arrived with the Davenport close and the Carter family Christmas dinner and a conversation with Dr. Okafor that Emily went into alone and came out of with Ryan waiting in the lobby of the medical building, which she had not asked him to do and which she found, when she saw him standing there in his overcoat, that she was not going to argue about. How did it go? He said. It's manageable, she said. Which was true. The plan Dr. Okafor had laid out was clear and actionable and more hopeful than Emily had feared. Harder than what they'd been doing, but manageable. We have options. Good. He handed her a coffee. The right place, the right order. Do you want to walk? They walked 2 blocks in the December cold, and she told him the outline of the medical plan, and he listened, and when she finished, he said, What do you need to do first? I need to talk to the care facility Dr. Okafor recommended, and I need to rearrange my schedule for the next month to accommodate the transition. Send me the care facility information. I'll make some calls. She stopped walking. Ryan, not to override your decisions, to make sure the calls happen faster. He stopped too, turned toward her on the sidewalk. You know how to do all of this. I just have a phone that certain people answer more quickly. She looked at him, at the overcoat, at the coffee cup she was holding, still warm. Okay, she said. Good. He started walking again. The Christmas dinner is Sunday. The subject shift was deliberate, she knew. He was giving her a transition, a way out of the weight of the previous 20 minutes. She was grateful for it. I know, she said. Eleanor called me. He glanced sideways at her. Eleanor called you directly? Tuesday. We've been talking. She registered his expression. You look surprised. My mother doesn't call people directly. My mother has things brought to people. She called me herself. We talked for 20 minutes about Margaret. I'd mentioned my mother to her at the Greenwich lunch, and she remembered and wanted to know how she was doing. Emily paused. She also gave me what I believe was a very subtle but entirely clear message that she thinks you've been an idiot for most of the past decade, and that she's glad you apparently stopped. Ryan was quiet for several steps. She said that. Not in those words, but I've been parsing subtext professionally for 7 years. That was the message. He looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of a relationship he thought he knew well. My mother is more... He stopped. She doesn't usually. She's protective of you, Emily said. She just shows it sideways. He was quiet again, the thoughtful quiet. Does that mean she knows about the arrangement? Emily had wondered the same thing during the phone call. I don't think she knows the specific details, she said carefully. I think she's made her own assessment. She's not the kind of woman who misses things. No, he agreed. She's not. They walked another block. The city did its winter thing around them, breath visible in the cold air, the smell of food from somewhere nearby, the particular stripped-down honesty of New York in December when the tourist season was done, and it was just the people who actually lived there. The Christmas dinner, Emily said. Will it be difficult? The family? All of them together? It's always difficult, he said, without self-pity. It's family, but it's different this year. Different how? He looked at her. Lily has been asking if you're coming since Monday. She asked me yesterday if you have a favorite Christmas ornament, and I said I didn't know, and she said, he stopped, something moving through his face. She said she was going to make you one, so you'd have a favorite. Emily felt her chest do the thing she'd stopped being able to prevent around any mention of Lily. What kind of ornament? She managed. A horse, he said, and the ghost of the real laugh was there, quiet and slow, with the crinkle at the corner of his eye. Obviously, Mum. The Carter family Christmas dinner was on a Sunday, and Emily brought Margaret. It had been Ryan's suggestion, floated carefully 3 days earlier. If she's well enough, if she'd like to, no pressure whatsoever. And Emily had brought it to her mother with the same carefulness, and Margaret had said, I'd like that very much, with the simple directness she brought to most things, which had settled the matter. They arrived in Ryan's car, which he drove himself because George had the day off, and Margaret sat in the back and looked at Manhattan passing outside the window with the wondering attention of someone experiencing something they hadn't expected to find beautiful. He drives himself, Margaret observed. Sometimes, Emily said. That's interesting, her mother said, and said nothing more. But Emily could hear in the 2 words that her mother had filed this away in a particular category of information. Eleanor Carter met them at the door. She looked at Margaret for a moment with the assessing quality that Eleanor brought to everything, and then she did something Emily had not seen Eleanor Carter do in 10 weeks of knowing her. She took both of Margaret's hands in hers. I'm so glad you could come, she said, and she meant it. Eleanor's meaning things was by now a quality Emily could read, the specific warmth that cut through the composed surface when it was real. Emily talks about you often. Margaret looked at Eleanor with the clear eyes of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading people. And she talks about your family, she said, with a great deal of affection. Emily looked at her mother. Her mother did not look back, but the corner of her mouth moved almost imperceptibly. The dinner was loud and complicated in the way of families that have histories and tensions and long-running arguments that get paused and resumed across multiple holidays. Gerald managed, in the first hour, to imply 3 separate things that required careful reframing. Patricia was improved. She and Emily had arrived at a détente after the terrace conversation that hadn't been formally acknowledged, but was functionally real. Diana was herself, warm, funny, asking Margaret questions about Ohio with the genuine curiosity she brought to people she found interesting, which Margaret seemed to appreciate in kind. Lily had given Emily the ornament before dinner. She'd produced it from behind her back with the solemnity of someone presenting something important, and it was a horse, as promised, made from air-dry clay, and painted a complicated combination of colors that should not have worked together, but somehow did. Its legs were, Emily noted, correct. The front left and back right, the front right and back left. You remembered the gait, Emily said. I practiced, Lily said, very seriously. It took 4 tries to get the legs right. I threw away the ones with wrong legs. You should only have the good one. Emily looked at the ornament. She turned it over in her hands. It was lumpy in places and the paint was slightly uneven, and one ear was larger than the other. "This is the best ornament I've ever been given," she said. Lily studied her face for the tell of an adult managing a child. She apparently found none because she nodded once with satisfaction. "I know," she said, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Ryan had watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway. When Emily looked up, he was looking at her in that way again. The way she'd stopped being able to categorize. The one that required a different word than any she'd used for him before. She held up the ornament. He smiled. "The real one, hmm?" It was after dinner, in the kitchen, that the thing happened that Emily hadn't anticipated, and that forced into the open the conversation she'd been carrying alone since the medical building. The kitchen at the end of a Carter family Christmas dinner was a specific kind of chaos. Dishes and half-eaten desserts, and multiple conversations happening simultaneously while various family members found reasons to be in the same small space. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table with Diana and Eleanor, the three of them deep in a conversation that seemed to have started with a recipe and evolved into something else entirely. Gerald was attempting to help clean up in a way that was creating more work than it resolved. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch in the adjacent room, one arm around a stuffed horse, and the house had the particular quality of things having been genuinely, messily, imperfectly celebrated. Emily was at the sink with Ryan, doing dishes, which was where they'd ended up because someone had to, and it was natural, and the fact that it was natural was itself something she spent a moment sitting with. "She's good," Ryan said quietly, beside her, tilting his head toward the table where Margaret was laughing at something Diana had said. Margaret's laugh was the same as it had always been, unguarded, full, the laugh of a woman who found things genuinely funny. "She is," Emily said. "Today's a good day." He was quiet, washing a pan. "Do you know yet? About the facility? Whether you're going to—" "I talked to them on Friday." She handed him a dish to dry. "It's good. Dr. Okafor was right. It would be better than what we have now. More support, more consistent care." She paused. "It's also significantly more expensive than what I can currently cover." He said nothing. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "I haven't said anything." "You're going to say you'll help, and I'm going to say—" She stopped, looked at the sink, at the water running over her hands. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for a week." She turned off the water, turned to look at him. "I don't want to take money from you, not because of pride, or not only because of pride, because the shape of this—" She gestured between them. "The shape of us, whatever we are, I don't want it to be structured around me needing things from you. I don't want to be the woman who took the money and also the man." He looked at her steadily. "Emily, let me finish." She kept her voice low, aware of the kitchen full of family behind them. "I've been thinking about what you said in my office, about being here, about this not being an endpoint, and I believe you. I do." She took a breath. "But I need to know that when I'm standing next to you in a room, any room, your boardroom, your family's kitchen, anywhere, I'm there because of who I am, not because of what I need. Do you understand?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "So the money, the arrangement money, the $2 million, I want to use it for her care. That's mine. I earned it, and I'm not going to refuse it out of some idea that I should struggle more than I have to." She met his eyes. "But anything beyond that, anything going forward, that's not a transaction. That's something different, and I need it to be different. Do you understand what I'm saying?" He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she had time to wonder if she'd said it wrong, if the distinction she was drawing made sense to anyone other than her. "You're saying you want to stand next to me as yourself," he said, "not as someone who owes me something." "Yes." "You have always been yourself next to me," he said. "From the first 10 minutes, every room we've been in. You've never been anything else." She looked at the dish towel in her hands. "I know that's how you see it," she said quietly. "I'm telling you what I need for how I see it." He considered that. "Okay," he said. "Then we do it your way. The care is your decision, your resources, your call. And anything else, anything between us, is built on something that has nothing to do with any of that." He held her eyes. "Is that what you need?" "Yes," she said. "Then that's what we do. From the table behind them, Margaret said something that made Diana and Eleanor laugh again. That full, unguarded sound. And the kitchen smelled like coffee and the remnants of Christmas dinner, and Lily slept on the couch with her stuffed horse, and the December night was pressed against the windows. "Ryan," Emily said. "Yeah, I love you." She said it the way she said true things, without decoration, without hedging, without the careful scaffolding she usually built around anything that mattered too much, just plainly into the air between them. "I've been trying to find the right time to say it, and I've decided there probably isn't one, so that's what it is." He set down the pan he was drying. He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped having words for, and then he said, "I know. I've known for a while." He paused. "I love you too. I've been terrible at saying it." "You have," she agreed. "I'm working on it." "I know." She picked up the dish towel again. "You can start practicing." He almost laughed. The real one. Almost. "Right now? In my mother's kitchen?" "Later is fine." He picked up the pan again. They stood at the sink together in the complicated, imperfect, noisy warmth of his family's kitchen, and she thought about all the rooms she'd spent her life walking into with her chin up and her armor on, performing belonging until she got good enough at it to forget she was performing. She wasn't performing now. She was just standing at a sink, in a kitchen that smelled like Christmas, next to someone she loved. It was the simplest thing. She hadn't expected it to feel like that. So much quieter than she'd imagined, so much less dramatic than the gala or the board meeting or any of the moments she'd clocked as significant. Just this. The domestic ordinary of it. The realness. Behind them, Margaret looked up from the table and found her daughter at the sink. And she looked at Emily's face. Not the ring, not Ryan, just Emily's face. And she looked back down at her coffee cup with the expression of a woman who has seen what she came to see. The conversation with Ryan that she'd been building toward for weeks happened not in his office and not in her apartment, but in the Metropolitan Museum of Art on a Tuesday afternoon in the last week of December, which was where they'd ended up after a lunch that had run long and neither of them wanted to end. The museum in late December had a particular quality, less crowded than the tourist months, the great rooms quieter, the light different through the high windows, the whole place feeling somehow more itself without the summer throng. They'd wandered through the American wing, and then through the European galleries, and then into the long corridor of Greek and Roman antiquities. And Emily had been thinking, as she walked beside him, about how different this was from every imagined version of herself she'd constructed growing up. She'd imagined a lot of versions. Better apartment, more stable life. Her mother healthy. Those were the versions she'd built toward. She'd never imagined this one. The museum on a Tuesday, the man beside her, the ring on her finger that had stopped feeling like a prop somewhere around the second week of December. She stopped in front of a marble figure, a woman, ancient and slightly damaged, missing one arm, the remaining one extended as if reaching for something that was no longer there. "I have something to tell you," she said. Ryan stopped beside her. "I've been offered a position," she said, "by the Meridian Foundation. Christine Park called me last week." She kept her eyes on the marble figure. "They want to bring someone in to lead their legal and compliance work. It's a real position. Not connected to Carter Global, not connected to any of this. It came from Christine because of the board meeting." "The Davenport argument," he said. Yes." She paused. "It would mean leaving private practice. It would mean building something new. She finally looked at him. "It's the kind of thing I've been working toward without knowing I was working toward it. The kind of work that matters beyond the individual client." He held her eyes. "What do you want to do?" "I want to take it," she said. "I think I want to take it." "Then take it." "Ryan, it's at the Meridian Foundation. It means I'll be in rooms adjacent to your world indefinitely, which is Emily." He said her name with a patience that was edged with something warmer. "I'm not asking you to keep your professional life at a distance from mine. I'm asking you to marry me. Those things are going to overlap." She looked at him. "You're very calm about this." "I'm extremely not calm about this," he said. "I've been waiting for 3 weeks for you to figure out what you actually want and let me know, and I've been—" He exhaled. "Not calm, but I know better than to push you toward a decision. You get there on your own timeline." "I do," she agreed. "So, He looked at her. Do you want to take the position? Yes. Do you want to marry me? Actually marry me. Not in January, not as an endpoint to the contract. Actually. She looked at the marble figure, the missing arm, the extended hand, the reaching toward something that had been gone for 2,000 years. Yes, she said. Actually. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and took the hand that had the ring on it, just held it, without drama. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They stood in the quiet museum corridor with the winter light coming through the high windows, not saying anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying right now. The rest of it, the family, the work, the complicated practical future of two people who had come from very different places and were building toward the same one, that was all still ahead of them. It would be difficult in the ways that real things were difficult. It would not be smooth or perfect or without friction, but it was real. That was the part that mattered. That was the part that nothing in the contract had been able to produce, and nothing in the arrangement had accounted for, and nothing that Marcus had planned had engineered. Real was the thing that had happened anyway, underneath everything, while they'd been busy building something else. Emily held his hand in the quiet museum and didn't look away from the marble figure, the missing arm, the reaching gesture, the ancient and slightly damaged thing that had survived anyway, and thought that the most important decisions of her life had almost all been made in 2 seconds in impossible situations. A lobby, an elevator, a car, a sink, a museum corridor in December, with the ring on her finger and the city outside and all the difficult, ordinary, irreplaceable future still ahead of them. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They walked on through the quiet museum, not in any hurry, for the first time in a long time with nowhere else they needed to be. January arrived the way it always did in New York, without ceremony, without the gentle transition that other months sometimes offered. Just a hard turn of the calendar, the holiday lights coming down overnight, the city returning to itself with the particular grim efficiency of a place that had indulged for 2 weeks and was now done with it. The contract expired on January 23rd. Emily knew the date the way she knew court dates. It lived in the back of her mind with the particular weight of things that were coming, whether you were ready or not. She hadn't talked about it with Ryan since the museum. There had been enough else to talk about. The Davenport close, which happened on January 9th, with the quiet, anticlimactic efficiency of large transactions that have been long in the making. Margaret's transition to the new care facility, which took 2 weeks and was harder emotionally than Emily had anticipated, despite knowing it was the right decision. And the Meridian Foundation position, which Emily had formally accepted on January 3rd, giving herself 30 days to wind down her private practice in the way that felt responsible to the clients who had trusted her with cases that were still midstream. She was busy. She had always been good at being busy, but the 23rd was coming regardless. It was Ryan who brought it up first, on a Thursday evening in the second week of January, sitting in Emily's kitchen in Washington Heights in the particular domestic disorder of a meal they'd made together, or that Emily had mostly made while Ryan had been nominally helpful and actually mostly in the way, which was something she'd learned about him in December and which she found, against all reason, endearing. The contract expires in 10 days, he said. She was washing a pot. I know. I want to be official about what happens after. She set down the pot, turned around. He was at the kitchen table with the remnants of dinner around him, looking at her with the directness he used when he'd been working up to something. Official how? She said. I want to ask you properly. He said it without preamble, without the speech-making quality of the gala. Not in a ballroom, not in front of cameras, not as part of any narrative. I want to ask you here, in your kitchen, with whatever is currently on your stove and your mother's plants on the windowsill. He paused. Will you marry me? Actually, permanently, with full knowledge of what you're getting into, including Gerald, at every major holiday, and Lily's very strong opinions about almost everything, and the fact that I am apparently not capable of helping make dinner without being more of a problem than a solution. Emily looked at him for a long moment. You burned the garlic bread, she said. I did. You were watching something on your phone. A board update, yes. That's going to keep happening, isn't it? Almost certainly. He held her eyes. Emily. She picked up the dish towel. She folded it. She did this with the slightly excessive care of someone buying herself 3 seconds to organize her face, which Ryan had long since learned to recognize and was now watching with the patient attention of a man who had made his peace with her timelines. "Yes," she said. "Same answer as before. Same answer as the museum." "I know. I wanted it set again, in the right place." She looked around her kitchen. The small, clean, particular kitchen of a life she'd built, one careful choice at a time, with her mother's plants and her mother's calendar and the overhead light that buzzed faintly at full brightness and that she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. "This is the right place," she said. He looked around it too, not with the evaluating eye of a man comparing it to his own penthouse, but with the attention of someone learning a room that matters. "Yes," he said, "it is." The contract expired 10 days later and neither of them mentioned it, because by then it had already become irrelevant. A document that had described the beginning of something and had no language for what it had become. They got married in April, not in a venue that Marcus selected, not in front of cameras, not in the event space that Eleanor had initially suggested, with the particular gentle force of a woman who believed that occasions should be marked with appropriate scale. Those conversations had happened. Eleanor had presented 3 options, each one progressively grander, and Emily had listened to all 3 and then said, quietly and without apology, "I'd like something small." And Ryan had said, "Small is what we're doing." And Eleanor had looked between them and said, after a moment, "I'll find a garden." Okyan. She did? A small private garden attached to a historic townhouse in the West Village, something the Carter family had a connection to that Emily chose not to examine too closely, because some aspects of having access to old money were easier to accept when you didn't know the full mechanics. The garden in April was bare-branched and pale-budded and honest about what it was, which was a thing just beginning to come back. 42 people. That was the number. Not because they'd set a limit, but because 42 was how many people they actually wanted there. Ryan's family. Eleanor, who wore a dove-gray suit and who had kissed Emily on the cheek when she arrived and said simply, "Welcome," and meant it in a way that carried the weight of everything they'd both chosen not to say over the past 4 months. Diana and Thomas. A few cousins. Not Gerald, who had been cordially not invited on the grounds that his presence at intimate occasions tended to create work for other people. Christine Park, who came because Ryan had asked her and because she had been, in ways she'd never take credit for, part of how this had happened. Emily's side, Diane, who had been her maid of honor with the particular combination of warmth and merciless honesty that had defined their friendship for 12 years, and who had cried twice already before the ceremony and was firmly denying both instances. 3 colleagues from her old practice who had known her long enough to have watched her become herself. 2 friends from law school who still texted at midnight about case strategy and who would probably do so forever. Dr. Okafor, who had accepted the invitation with a kind of quiet professional pleasure that Emily found moving, and Margaret. Margaret was in a wheelchair now, which was a change from 3 months ago, and she had opinions about the chair that she expressed regularly and colorfully, but she had been at the garden at 10 in the morning, 2 hours before the ceremony, because she wanted to see it before the people arrived. Emily had pushed her around the garden paths, both of them quiet, the morning light very clear and thin the way April mornings were, and her mother had looked at the budding branches and the chairs being set out and the small wooden arch someone was weaving with white flowers and had said, "It looks like something that actually happened, not something that was performed." "That's what we wanted," Emily said. "I know." Margaret reached back and covered Emily's hand on the wheelchair handle. "You did well, baby." It was the same hand covering as the night at the apartment, the same warmth, the same weight of all the years before. Emily stood behind the wheelchair in the April garden and let herself feel it. The full complicated weight of this moment, all the work and the fear and the too much garlic and the wrong diagonal sandwiches and the lobby 11 weeks ago that had been the most chaotic and improbable beginning she could have designed. And look where they'd ended up. She did not cry. She had a ceremony to get through. But it was close. Well, Lily wore a blue dress that she had chosen herself after rejecting 4 others, and that was slightly wrinkled by the time the ceremony began, because she had spent the morning lying on the grass in it, examining something she'd found interesting near the garden wall, which Ryan had discovered when he came to collect her 20 minutes before the ceremony and which he had decided, correctly, was not worth addressing. She walked with him to the arch. She was the one who carried the rings. She'd asked for this job with the seriousness of someone applying for a position that required vetting, and she had held the small pillow with the focused care of a person acutely aware of responsibility. Emily came down the aisle, which was not an aisle, just a path through the chairs, the grass slightly uneven under her feet, her dress the color of spring in the way that she'd decided things should be for a garden ceremony in April, and not midnight blue and not white, and not anything that looked like a performance. Diane was behind her, still pretending she hadn't cried. Margaret was in the front row with Eleanor beside her, which was something that had happened naturally over the past 4 months, and that Emily sometimes thought about when she thought about what had been built here beyond just a marriage. Ryan watched her come toward him, and he looked the way he looked when he was not managing his face, open, a little undone, entirely himself. The officiant was a judge named Harrison, who was a friend of Christine's and who had a gift for brevity, which Emily had specifically requested. He said what needed to be said. He did not say anything about the lobby or the contract or any of it. Those stories were theirs, not ceremonial material. They had written their own vows, which Emily had resisted initially on the grounds that she was not a writer, and Ryan had argued for on the grounds that anything anyone else had written wouldn't be accurate, and he was right about that as it turned out. Ryan went first. He looked at her, and he said, "I have been managing things for a long time. Managing the company and managing the family and managing the public version of myself, and most of all, managing the fact that I'd decided somewhere along the way that letting anyone actually close to me was a risk I couldn't afford. And then you walked out of a revolving door and into what was genuinely the worst morning of my adult life. And within about 30 seconds, you were the steadiest thing in the room." He paused. "You have never once let me get away with performing when the real thing was available. You have argued with my board and fed my daughter and talked to my mother and taken care of your mother with the kind of daily, relentless, unglamorous courage that doesn't show up in any press coverage, and I have been watching you do all of it, and I have been—" He stopped, gathered something. "I have been so grateful that you exist, that you are who you are. I promise to be worth it. I won't always succeed, but I promise to try every day." Emily had prepared something. She'd written it out and revised it 3 times and memorized it with the same focus she brought to courtroom arguments. She looked at him, and she said none of it. "I came from very little," she said instead, "because that was the true beginning. And I built everything I have by deciding that not having something was not the same as not deserving it. I spent a long time fighting for rooms I belonged in, and then I walked into your lobby and you grabbed my arm, and I made the most impulsive decision of my life. And it turned out—" She took a breath. "It turned out that the room I'd been fighting to get into was not a boardroom or a courtroom or any of the rooms I'd been aiming at. It was your kitchen. Your daughter's kitchen table with the colored pencils, the car at 11 o'clock at night going nowhere particular." She looked at him. This man who cut sandwiches in the wrong diagonal and burned garlic bread watching board updates, and laughed quietly and slowly with a crinkle at the corner of one eye. "I love who I am when I'm with you. Not because you made me better, I did that work myself, but because you see the work and you don't look away from it. I promise to see you the same way." Lily delivered the rings with absolute precision and a face of deep concentration. When it was done, she stood back and looked at the 2 of them and gave one small, satisfied nod, which Emily caught and which made her chest ache in the best possible way. Judge Harrison said the words. Ryan kissed her, briefly, real, without performance. The 42 people made a sound that was not quite applause and not quite something else. The particular warm noise of people who are genuinely happy for what they've just witnessed. Margaret reached over and took Eleanor's hand, which was something neither of them would have predicted 3 months ago, and Eleanor let her, which was also something, and didn't let go. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Emily would be clear about this if anyone asked, which people occasionally did. The story had been public enough that strangers sometimes felt entitled to the next chapter, and Emily had developed a pleasant, firm way of redirecting those inquiries that Ryan called the smile that means the conversation is over, which she acknowledged was accurate. The reality was this: 2 people who had come from very different places and had very different habits and very different ways of moving through the world were now building a shared life in a 5-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side, which Ryan owned and Emily had moved into in May. and which continued to surprise her in small ways every day. The space of it, the particular quality of light in the rooms that faced west, the fact that there was a second bathroom and she did not have to negotiate for it. She kept the apartment in Washington Heights for 4 months after the wedding, paying rent on a place she no longer lived in because she needed the knowing it was there, the exit that she'd built and that she could choose not to use. Ryan never mentioned it. He understood, she thought, without needing it explained, and this was one of the things about him that she had stopped cataloging and had simply started depending on. She gave up the apartment in September. Lily, 7 now, accepted the full reality of Emily's permanent presence in her life with the pragmatic adaptability of a child who had decided months ago that the decision was made and therefore spent no energy on ambivalence. She had preferences about how things were done. Her preferences were, at this point, well documented, and Emily navigated them with the same focused attention she brought to complex cases, which Lily apparently found appropriate because she told Ryan once, overheard through a door, "Emily takes me seriously," as if this were the relevant metric, which it was. The horse ornament from Christmas hung on the refrigerator. Not seasonally, all year on the refrigerator, because that was where Lily had put it after the wedding, and Emily had seen no reason to move it. The Meridian Foundation work was harder than Emily had anticipated, and also more meaningful than she'd been prepared for. Christine Park was, in real life and not just a boardroom, someone worth knowing. Sharp and unsentimental, and with a history of practice that Emily found herself learning from in ways she hadn't expected to, at 31, to still be learning from someone. The work was not glamorous. A lot of it was exactly the kind of painstaking structural legal work that didn't make news and didn't produce dramatic courtroom moments and was, nonetheless, the work that kept organizations honest and protected the people who moved through them. Emily found that she was good at it in the specific way that meant it was the right fit. Not easy, but right. She called Diane every Wednesday. She visited Margaret every Sunday without exception, which had become the rhythm of their relationship now that Margaret was not in the same apartment. The particular discipline of choosing the relationship actively, of making it something you showed up for rather than something that simply surrounded you. Margaret's health stabilized in the summer, not improving, not in any dramatic way, but plateauing at a level that Dr. Okafor called better than my projection, and which Emily privately called the stubbornness of a woman who had survived 25 years of cleaning other people's houses and was not going to be undone by a set of kidneys that had decided to underperform. She brought Lily sometimes, on the Sunday visits. Lily and Margaret had developed a relationship that Emily observed with a kind of stunned gratitude. They played cards badly, both of them competitive in the specific way that made losing unacceptable, and they argued about the rules of games in ways that somehow ended with both of them satisfied. Margaret had taught Lily to make pasta, too much garlic, because there was no other way. And Lily had come home and made it for Ryan and Emily on a Tuesday evening with the solemnity of someone transmitting important cultural knowledge. It tasted exactly right. Ryan stepped back from the day-to-day management of Carter Global in August. He didn't leave. He remained chairman, remained involved in the strategic decisions that were his to make, continued to be the person that the board ultimately reported to. But the operational running of the company, the daily meetings, the crisis management, the endless churn of being the face and voice and decision-maker for 4,000 employees, he handed that to a woman named Sarah Okonkwo, whom he'd been quietly preparing for 18 months, and who walked into the role with the assurance of someone who had been ready longer than anyone had officially acknowledged. Emily had watched him make this decision over 6 months. She'd watched him circle it, examine it, argue himself out of it twice, and finally arrive at it with the particular quiet of someone setting down something heavy that they'd been carrying for so long they'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be that heavy. "How do you feel?" she asked him, the evening after he'd made the formal announcement. They were in the kitchen. His kitchen, their kitchen, the kitchen that still had the crayon drawing on the shelf and the horse figurine on the windowsill, and now also a set of dishes that Emily had brought from Washington Heights, the set her mother had found at a garage sale, the good ones that Margaret had saved for when life got better. Life had gotten better. "Strange," he said honestly. He was at the counter with a glass of water, not performing anything, just present. "Like I've been holding my breath for 4 years and I finally stopped, and now I don't know what my lungs are supposed to do." "They breathe," she said. "That's generally the move." He almost laughed. "Right." "What do you want to do with it?" she said. The time? The space? He thought about it. Not the quick, efficient thinking of someone computing a business answer, but the slower kind. The kind she'd watched him rediscover over the past year. The kind that meant he was actually asking himself the question, rather than asking himself what the right answer was supposed to be. "I want to be here," he said. "More than I have been. For Lily's school things and for your impossible work schedule and for—" He paused. "I want to learn to cook something that isn't breakfast." "That's a low bar. I'm being realistic about my abilities. You burned the garlic bread." "I was distracted." "You're always distracted." But she said it with the particular warmth that had replaced any criticism in it, because being with someone meant knowing their specific flavors of failure and deciding they were acceptable, and she'd decided his were. He looked at her across the kitchen. This ordinary weekday evening, the city going dark outside the windows, and Lily somewhere down the hall doing homework with the specific intensity she brought to things she'd decided to be good at. "Emily," he said. "Yeah." "Are you happy?" She looked around the kitchen, at the dishes from the garage sale, at the horse figurine, at the man at the counter who had burned the garlic bread and who was asking her the question with the plain, undefended openness of someone who genuinely wanted to know. She thought about the lobby. About 2 seconds and a decision she couldn't undo. About the contract in the drawer that she'd finally shredded in February, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just fed it through the shredder in her office on a Tuesday morning because it was a document that described something that no longer existed. "Yes," she said, specifically and genuinely. He nodded once, like he was recording it. "Good," he said. "Me too." On a Friday evening in October, almost a year to the day from the morning it had all started, Emily sat at the kitchen table after dinner while Ryan was putting Lily to bed and thought about that lobby. She thought about it the way you thought about things that had changed you, not with the fuzzy sentimentality of someone who had romanticized it, but with the clear-eyed attention of someone who understood both the randomness and the consequence of it. The specific accident of timing. The particular exhaustion in a stranger's face that had made her pause when she should have walked past. The 2 seconds that had been, she now understood, the hinge of everything. She thought about what she'd been before that morning. Not lesser. She was careful about that. Careful not to construct a narrative where Ryan Carter had improved her, because that wasn't what had happened. She had always been who she was. She had always been capable of this life. What the lobby had done was not change her, but interrupt the very specific path she'd been on. The one where she managed everything alone, where she was excellent and self-sufficient, and quietly, steadily exhausted. Where the life she was building was solid and real, and also contained no room for the kind of risk that required trusting someone else with the parts that could break. She had been scared of that risk for so long she'd stopped calling it fear and started calling it practicality. She looked at the kitchen around her. The dishes, the horse figurine, the child's drawing on the shelf that was still there, would probably always be there, because it was Lily's and Lily's things stayed where Lily put them. She heard down the hall the sound of Ryan's voice. The bedtime story voice, lower and slower than his regular one, the voice she'd first heard through a door in December and that she had unconsciously been listening for ever since. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. The thing about loving someone, she had learned, and this was the thing she hadn't known going in, the thing no arrangement or contract could have told her, was that it was not a single decision. It was not the 2 seconds in a lobby, or the yes at the gala, or the yes in the museum, or the yes in her kitchen in January. It was not the wedding. It was every morning after the wedding, every ordinary Tuesday, every burned garlic bread and wrong diagonal sandwich and phone call that ran too long. Every time you chose to be in the room with someone, rather than alone with your own competence. Every time you let yourself be helped without it costing you your sense of who you were. She had been afraid, most of her life, that wanting things was the first step toward losing them, that the life she'd built by keeping her hands open and her expectations careful was the only safe way to have a life. She thought about her mother in the care facility, playing bad cards with Lily, about Eleanor and Margaret and the hand that had not been let go, about Diane, who had known before Emily knew and had waited and not said "I told you so," even once, which was genuine friendship, about the 42 people in a garden in April, about all the rooms she'd fought her way into that had turned out not to be the destination. Ryan came back down the hall and appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had the tired quality of a parent who has done the bedtime routine and is now standing in the specific post-Lily quiet of an apartment where a 7-year-old has just stopped generating noise. Asleep? Emily said. Almost. She had opinions about the story. She always has opinions about the story. She wanted me to change the ending of the one I was reading. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from her. I said I couldn't change the ending because the author had written it. She said the author should have asked her first. Emily smiled. She's not wrong. She's rarely wrong. It's exhausting. But the way he said it was the way it always was. The thing that sounded like complaint and was entirely love. They sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of a Friday evening, the city doing its October thing outside. Cooler now. The particular quality of fall arriving, the light going early the way it did. Neither of them said anything for a minute. The silence was the kind that had accumulated over a year of evenings like this one, that had weight and comfort and the particular ease of being with someone with whom silence didn't require management. I've been thinking about the lobby, Emily said. He looked at her. What about it? I've been thinking about how... She paused, finding the words. How random it was. How completely accidental. If my client call had ended on time, I would have been out of the building before you arrived. If I'd been on the other side of the lobby. If I'd been on my phone. You were on your phone, he said. You almost walked past me. I almost walked past you, she agreed. What made you stop? She thought about it. Actually thought about it. Not the version she told, but the real one. Your face, she said. You look the way I feel sometimes, when I'm holding too many things at once, and I'm almost at the end of what I can hold. I recognized it. He was quiet for a moment. I recognized something in you too, he said. In the lobby. I didn't know what it was then. I just knew you were steady in a way I needed. I was terrified. You were terrified and steady, he said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She thought about that. About all the things that were possible simultaneously. Scared and brave, practical and impulsive, holding the line and letting go. About the fact that the most important things she'd ever done had involved walking into situations she wasn't ready for and figuring it out as she went, because readiness was a thing you built inside the experience, not before it. I want to tell you something, she said. Okay, I don't think about the $2 million anymore. She said it plainly, not as a statement about nobility or about transcending the transaction, but as simple fact. For the first few months, I thought about it constantly. What it meant, what I'd traded for it, whether it changed what this was. And then at some point I stopped thinking about it, and I realized I'd stopped thinking about it, and I realized that meant the answer to the question was no. It didn't change what this was. She looked at him. I just wanted you to know that. Ryan held her eyes. I stopped thinking about the contract about 3 weeks in, he said. The day you called the analyst. She almost laughed. The Mercer analyst, at 7 a.m, because you'd read 400 pages of acquisition documentation and had thoughts. He looked at her with the expression she had stopped trying to find better words for because she had just decided to call it what it was. Love, plain and slightly worn, the kind that had already been through some things. That was the day I stopped performing and started actually being in trouble. In trouble, she repeated, in the best sense. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The same gesture her mother had made. The same warmth. The same weight of things that didn't need to be said because they were too large for words and too real for performance. He turned his hand over and held hers. Outside the window, October continued. The city moved through its Friday evening with the indifference of cities, which did not pause for private moments and kitchen tables, which did not care about the specific unbelievable series of events that had produced this particular Friday in this particular kitchen. The city just was, as it always was, and the people inside it made their lives inside that vast indifference. And some of those lives, by accident or design, or the specific collision of terrible timing and 2 seconds of impulsiveness, turned out to be more than anyone had planned for. Margaret called at 8 o'clock, which she did most Fridays now, and Emily talked to her for 20 minutes while Ryan did the dishes. He was getting better at the dishes, progressively better, though he still could not be trusted with anything that required timing. And her mother asked how the week had been, and Emily told her the real version, the ordinary version full of ordinary things, and Margaret listened and said good, and meant it the way she always meant things, which was completely. After she hung up, Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her fox pajamas. She still had the fox pajamas, the same pair from a year ago, slightly small now, worn soft from washing. Because she had not actually been asleep, which was not surprising, and because she had, she explained, a question. "What's the question?" Ryan said from the sink. "When Emily moved in," Lily said, with the careful precision of someone who has been formulating this for a while, "did she move in because of the arrangement or because she wanted to?" The kitchen was quiet. Emily looked at Ryan. He looked at her. "Because she wanted to," Emily said. "How do you know?" Lily said. "Because I'm still here," Emily said. "The arrangement ended a long time ago." Lily considered this with the thoroughness she brought to information she intended to retain. "Okay," she said. "I was just checking." "And?" Ryan said. "And what? And what's the verdict?" Lily looked between them with the assessing dark eyes that had been assessing Emily since a kitchen table in November, since colored pencils and a horse with the wrong legs, since a question about triangles and a small girl who had been deciding something long before either of the adults in the room had finished deciding it themselves. "I think you made a good choice," Lily said to Emily. "Even though it started weird." "It started very weird," Emily agreed. "Most good things do," Lily said with the breezy authority of a 7-year-old who has decided this is true, and went back to bed. Ryan and Emily looked at the empty doorway where she'd been. "She's not wrong," Emily said. "She's rarely wrong," Ryan said. "I told you." She looked at him across the kitchen, the man who had not been able to help with dinner, and who had burned the garlic bread, and who had stood in a lobby on the worst morning of his life, and made a desperate, impulsive, completely irrational decision that had turned out, against all reasonable expectation, to be the best one. She thought about what it meant. The thing that Lily had just said with the offhand wisdom of a child who didn't know she was being wise. Most good things start weird. Most real things start sideways and inconvenient and in the wrong order. Most love, the actual kind, not the kind that looks like love from the outside, begins in some moment you wouldn't have chosen and wouldn't have designed and could not have predicted. A lobby, a grabbed arm, 2 seconds, and then everything, slowly, becoming real. She got up from the table. She went to help with the dishes, which Ryan would not have asked for, and which he made room for immediately, shifting over without needing to be told. They stood at the sink in the Friday night quiet of their home, this life, this specific improbable accumulation of choices that had started in chaos and landed here. And the water ran warm, and the city continued outside, and somewhere down the hall, Lily was probably still awake. And this was it. This was the thing. Not the gala, not the ring in a ballroom, not the board meeting or the headlines or any of the public, camera-ready moments that the world had seen and decided it understood. This, the kitchen on a Friday, the dishes, the child down the hall in fox pajamas, who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and who had given Emily an ornament with correctly positioned legs because only the good one was worth giving. Emily had spent a long time believing that the life she wanted was something she had to fight her way into. That belonging somewhere required proving you deserved it, over and over, in every room, forever. She had been wrong about that. Not wrong that the fight was real. The fight had been real, every inch of it, and it had made her who she was. But wrong about the forever part. Wrong about there being no room that simply opened and said, "You, this one, come in." She was in that room now, and for the first time in her adult life, she was not planning the exit. She dried a bowl. She handed it to Ryan. He put it on the wrong shelf, which he always did, and she moved it to the right one without comment, which had become their system, and it was not a perfect system, but it was theirs. And that was the thing about real lives. They were not perfect systems. They were just the ones you chose, every day, on purpose. She chose this one. She would choose it again tomorrow. That, she had come to understand, was what love actually was. Not the lobby, not the ring, not any single moment of decision. It was the 10,000 ordinary mornings after. The wrong shelf and the burned garlic bread and the child in fox pajamas checking her facts. The phone call at 8 on Fridays. The dishes on a Friday night when nothing remarkable was happening and everything that mattered already had. Ryan turned off the tap. The kitchen went quiet. "Hey," he said. "Yeah, that was a good week." She thought about it. The Monday client call, the Wednesday foundation meeting. The Sunday visit with Margaret and Lily, and the spectacularly competitive card game. The Thursday evening in the kitchen where they'd made dinner badly and together, and it had been fine. Yeah, she said, it was. They turned off the kitchen light and went down the hall toward everything that came next, which was ordinary and irreplaceable and entirely completely real.